It was early October when I decided to take some time off work and get away from everything. I had been working long hours, barely sleeping, and I needed some quiet time to clear my head. I found a small cabin online, tucked deep in the woods about 4 hours from where I lived. It looked perfect. No neighbors, no cell signal, and just enough basic comforts to get by. I left early on a Friday morning. The drive was long but peaceful. As I got farther from the city, the roads narrowed and the trees thickened. The last hour was a winding dirt road, uneven in spots, but manageable. I reached the cabin in the late afternoon. It was small, built from rough wooden logs, with a single front door, 2 windows, and a slanted tin roof. There was a porch with a wooden chair and a rusted lantern hanging from a nail. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in a while, but it suited me fine. Inside, the air smelled musty. The cabin had a small kitchen area with a stove, a sink, and a small fridge powered by a gas generator out back. A single room held a bed, a dresser, and a small table with a chair. There was a wood stove for heat and a pile of chopped firewood stacked neatly by the wall. The bathroom was an outhouse about 20 feet behind the cabin. The first evening was quiet. I made a simple dinner, then sat outside on the porch, drinking a beer and listening to the forest. It was so quiet out there. No hum of traffic, no voices, no artificial lights. Just the wind moving through the trees and the occasional chirp of crickets. The first night, I slept hard. My body was tired, and for the first time in weeks, I wasn't thinking about emails or deadlines or meetings. I woke up once during the night and realized how dark it was. I mean, pitch black. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. The darkness felt thick, like it had weight to it. The next morning, I made breakfast and hiked a bit through the woods around the cabin. There was no marked trail, so I stayed close to the area. I didn't want to get lost. The forest was dense. The trees were tall and close together. Some of the trunks were scarred, like animals had scratched them. I didn't think much of it at the time. That evening, while I was out back gathering kindling for the stove, I heard something move behind me. It wasn't loud, just a soft rustle, like dry leaves being stepped on. I turned around but saw nothing. Still, I got this strange feeling in my chest, like something was there, but I couldn't see it. I went back inside, locked the door, and stayed close to the fire. That night, I didn't sleep as well. I kept waking up, feeling like I had heard something. A thud, a creak, branches snapping. I told myself it was just animals, maybe a raccoon or a deer. The woods were full of life after all. The next morning, I noticed something odd. Behind the cabin, about 30 feet into the trees, the ground looked disturbed, like something had been digging. I walked over to check. It wasn't a big hole, but it looked fresh. The dirt was dark and damp. There were marks around it, scuff marks like something had been dragged. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I told myself maybe an animal had been trying to bury food or something. Still, it stuck in my mind. Later that day, I found another spot. This one was deeper and closer to the cabin. Same dragged marks, same loose soil. Now I was starting to feel uneasy. It didn't make sense. These didn't look like animal diggings. They were too neat, too deliberate. That night, I heard footsteps, not just rustling or branches snapping. Actual heavy footsteps, slow, measured. They moved around the cabin, stopping occasionally, then starting again. I sat up in bed, barely breathing. I didn't have a gun, just a small hatchet and a kitchen knife. The footsteps circled the cabin twice before stopping. I waited for a long time before I moved. When I finally got up and peeked out the window, I saw nothing. The next morning, I found something on the porch, a dead rabbit. Its neck had been broken. It was laid out neatly like a gift. There was no blood, just the rabbit, stiff and cold, placed in front of the door. That was enough for me. I decided to leave. I packed up my things as fast as I could. When I tried to start my car, it wouldn't turn over. I popped the hood. Everything looked fine, but I wasn't a mechanic. I tried again. Still nothing. That's when I noticed the dirt on the driver's side door handle. Smudges. Fingerprints, maybe. Someone had been messing with my car. I went back inside and locked the door. I tried the satellite phone I had brought as a backup, but it wouldn't connect. I don't know why. Maybe the signal was too weak or the battery was dead. Either way, I was stuck there. I decided to stay inside, wait until morning, and then try hiking out. I had a map and a compass. If I followed the dirt road back, I could eventually reach the highway. It would be a long walk, but I didn't have a choice. That night was the worst. Just after dark, I heard movement again, but this time it was louder, closer. I heard something scrape along the wall of the cabin. Then something knocked on the window. Not hard, just a light tap, like someone testing the glass. Then I heard the door handle jiggle. Slowly, then harder. I sat in the corner with my hatchet, waiting. My heart felt like it was going to explode. Whoever it was, they didn't get in, but they stayed for hours, moving around the cabin. I could hear them breathing outside the window. I could hear the crunch of leaves under their feet. Sometimes they would stop, then it would go quiet. Then I'd hear a sudden thump on the wall, like they were trying to scare me. I didn't sleep at all. When the first light came through the trees, I grabbed my backpack, took a kitchen knife, and left. I didn't bother locking the cabin. I didn't care anymore. I just wanted to get out. I followed the dirt road, moving as fast as I could. The forest felt different that morning. Too quiet. I kept looking over my shoulder. At one point, I saw movement behind me. Something ducked behind a tree. I didn't stop to check. I just kept walking. After almost 5 hours, I reached a paved road. A pickup truck passed by, and I flagged it down. The driver was an older guy. He looked surprised to see me. I must have looked like hell. I didn't explain much, just asked for a ride to the nearest town. He dropped me at a diner, and I called a tow truck from there. When I went back with the tow driver the next day, the cabin looked the same from the outside. But the inside had been torn apart. Drawers pulled out, mattress flipped, food scattered. The strange thing was, the front door had still been locked when we got there. No broken windows, no forced entry. The place had been searched, but carefully, like someone was looking for something specific. The car had no battery. It had been removed, cleanly. There were no tire marks, no sign of another vehicle ever being there. The tow driver said maybe kids had messed with it. But I knew better. I didn't tell anyone the full story. Not the cops, not the rental company, not even my friends. I just said the car broke down and someone vandalized the cabin. I didn't want people thinking I was paranoid or imagining things. Weeks went by, couldn't sleep right. I kept hearing footsteps at night, even in my apartment. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that rabbit. I saw the dark woods. I heard the door handle moving. Eventually, I started sleeping again. Slowly, the nightmares faded. But I never went back to the woods. Never rented another cabin. And I sold that car even after the battery was replaced. Something about it just felt wrong. That trip was supposed to be a break, a reset. Instead, it showed me how fast things can go bad when you're alone. How the woods can hide more than just animals. No ghosts, no monsters, just real people doing things that don't make sense. Watching, waiting, and sometimes they pick the right moment and the right person to scare just enough to leave but not enough to tell. It started with a break from work. I had been working nonstop for over a year, and my boss finally insisted I take some time off before I burned myself out. I didn't argue. I needed it. I didn't want the beach, didn't want to travel abroad. I wanted silence, a place with no people, no phone signal, just me and nature. After scrolling through rental listings, I found a small off-grid cabin located deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. It was isolated, with no neighbors for miles, and the pictures showed an old wooden structure with a small porch, surrounded by thick forest. It looked perfect. The drive up took most of a day. The last stretch was a narrow dirt road that felt like it hadn't been used in months. My car bounced and groaned over the uneven surface, and branches brushed against the windows. Eventually, I saw the cabin tucked between tall pines and birch trees. It looked just like the pictures, maybe even better. There was no noise except the wind through the trees and the distant call of birds. I felt a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. I parked the car beside the cabin and unloaded my gear. I had packed light, just a duffel bag of clothes, some dried food, a camp stove, a water filter, a few tools, and a first aid kit. There was a wood pile next to the cabin and a small axe leaning against it. Inside was dusty but clean, with a single bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a shelf full of old books. The windows had shutters that creaked when I opened them. The air smelled like pine, dust, and something faintly musty. I didn't care. It was everything I wanted. The first couple of days went by easily. I hiked, read, and cooked simple meals. I spent hours just sitting on the porch watching squirrels run through the underbrush. The quiet was something I hadn't known I needed so badly. At night, the forest came alive with sound. Owls, insects, the occasional rustle of something in the leaves. I wasn't scared. I was finally alone with my thoughts, and that was what I had been craving. But by the 4th night, something changed. I woke up just after midnight. I didn't know what had stirred me, but I felt alert. I listened, heart beating fast, trying to figure out if I had heard something. Outside, the forest sounds were still there, but I could hear something else. Something slower, a kind of rhythmic crunching, like footsteps on gravel or dead leaves. I stayed in bed, not moving. It didn't sound close, maybe somewhere out past the trees. I told myself it could be a deer or maybe a bear, but it kept going slow and steady. Then it stopped. I lay there, staring at the ceiling until I eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I walked around the cabin but didn't see any tracks. The ground was covered in pine needles and dry leaves, not the easiest for tracking. Still, it bothered me. I spent most of the day thinking about it. I tried to push it out of my head and went on a long hike, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been nearby. That night, I locked the door and slid the heavy table in front of it. I felt a little silly, but it helped me sleep. At some point, I woke again. Same time, same feeling. I listened and heard the footsteps again, but this time they were closer. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. They sounded like they were just beyond the porch. Still slow, still steady. Then they stopped again. I sat in the dark for what felt like hours, waiting for them to start again, but they didn't. In the morning, I checked around the cabin again. Still nothing. I even walked a bit deeper into the woods in the direction I thought the sounds had come from. I didn't find anything. I started to feel paranoid. I told myself it had to be an animal, but the pattern of the steps, it was too slow and too even. I couldn't imagine an animal walking like that. On the 6th night, it got worse. I had just fallen asleep when something jolted me awake. A loud thud came from the porch. I stayed completely still, holding my breath. Then I heard the floorboards creak. Something was out there. I didn't have a gun, just a hatchet and a hunting knife. I reached for the hatchet and waited. The steps moved across the porch and then stopped right outside the door. The doorknob rattled, slowly, gently, like someone testing it. Couldn't believe it. I held the hatchet tight, heart pounding in my ears. The table I had pushed against the door didn't budge. After a while, the sound stopped. I didn't move until the sun came up. That morning, I packed my bag and loaded the car. I was done. I didn't care how much time was left on my rental. I couldn't explain what was happening, but I wasn't going to stay and find out. I locked up the cabin and went to start the car, but the engine didn't turn over. I tried again. Nothing. I opened the hood, not really knowing what I was doing. Everything looked fine, but I knew I wouldn't be able to fix it. I was stuck. I had no cell service and the nearest town was miles away. I had 2 options: stay put and hope someone came by or hike out. I decided to give it one more night and then hike out in the morning. I still had food, water, and the place was secure, or so I thought. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner of the room with the hatchet in my lap and a flashlight beside me. Just after midnight, I heard the steps again. They came straight up to the porch. Then I heard the creaking of the boards, slow and deliberate. Then silence. I held my breath, waiting. Then the window to the right of the door made a sharp cracking noise. Something hit it. Not hard enough to break it, but enough to shake the glass. Then another sound. A soft tapping like a finger or a stick. tap, tap. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Eventually, the sound stopped. The forest was quiet again. I waited until dawn before I opened the door. There was no sign of anyone.
No footprints.
Nothing. I started walking. I took only what I needed: water, food, knife, flashlight, and a map. I left the rest behind. I followed the dirt road, hoping it would lead me to someone, anyone. I walked all day. No cars.
No cabins.
Just trees. I started to think maybe I'd gone the wrong way. But by late afternoon, I saw a ranger station. It looked abandoned, but I knocked anyway. No answer. The door was open. Inside, it looked like no one had been there for months. Dust on the tables, old papers. But there was a landline phone. I picked it up. It had a dial tone. I called 911. A woman answered, and I gave her my name and location as best I could. She said they'd send someone. It took 3 hours, but eventually a sheriff's deputy showed up in a truck. I explained everything. He didn't say much, just nodded and listened. He drove me to the nearest town, and I got a motel room for the night. The next day, I went back with the deputy to get my car. When we got there, the hood was open. He looked at the engine and told me the battery cables had been pulled out. Clean, not torn, like someone had done it on purpose. We checked the cabin. Everything looked normal except one thing. On the table I had used to block the door, someone had carved a single word with something sharp. Stay. That was it for me. I left the car, left the cabin, and never went back. I still don't know who or what was out there, but it wasn't a ghost and it wasn't a bear. It was a person. Someone who had been watching me from the woods. Someone who didn't want me there. To this day, I don't camp alone anymore. I don't go off-grid. I don't want silence like that again. I wanted peace. What I found was something else entirely, and I'm lucky to have walked away. I don't really know why I'm writing this down. Maybe because if I don't, I'll go insane thinking about what happened to me that week in the mountains. Or maybe I just need to put it somewhere so it doesn't eat away at me. It's not a story I like to tell out loud, and I've only told a couple of people over the years. Not because I think they wouldn't believe me. There's nothing supernatural about it. That's what makes it worse. It all really happened. I'm not proud of the decisions I made out there, but I survived, and I guess that's worth something. It started in late September 2018. I had just quit a job I hated and wanted to disappear for a while. I needed to clear my head, so I rented this remote cabin up in northern Washington. It was deep in the foothills of the Cascades, about 2 hours from any town, completely off-grid. No cell service, no power lines, just solar panels for basic electricity and a water pump that fed from a nearby creek. I found it through an ad online. The guy who owned it was some retired forest ranger who used to live out there during the summers. He rented it out to people who wanted peace and quiet. I didn't think much of it. I packed a duffel with clothes, a box of food, a hunting knife, and my old bolt-action rifle. Not that I planned to use it, but my dad had taught me to always bring a gun into the woods, just in case. The drive up was beautiful. The road turned from pavement to gravel about 40 minutes from the last gas station. And from there it was winding and narrow, snaking through thick pine forest. I saw a few deer on the way, a coyote, even a black bear in the distance. Eventually, I reached the property, marked by a hand-painted wooden sign that just read, Spruce Hollow. There was a padlocked gate with a dirt trail behind it. I unlocked it using the code the owner had emailed me, drove through, and shut it behind me. The trail wasn't much better than a game path, just wide enough for one car. It led about half a mile through the trees before opening up into a small clearing with the cabin sitting at the center. It was a simple log cabin, single-story, with a tin roof and a wraparound porch. There was a small woodshed out back, a composting outhouse about 20 feet away, and a metal bear box for food storage. The place looked like it hadn't been used in a while, but it was clean inside. There was a single bed, a table with 2 chairs, a propane stove, a couple of shelves with books and tools, and a wood-burning stove for heat. No fridge, obviously. I brought a cooler with ice packs, but I knew they wouldn't last long, so I planned to eat canned food mostly. Soup, beans, dried pasta, that kind of thing. The first couple of days were great. I spent most of my time reading, chopping firewood, walking the woods, and just trying to disconnect from everything. There was a creek a few minutes walk away, and I filled a couple of jugs there every morning. The solar panel powered a few lights and a phone charger, but I kept my phone off most of the time to save battery. At night, I'd light some candles or lanterns and sit by the fire. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in years. No traffic, no news, just the wind in the trees and the occasional call of an owl. The first strange thing I noticed was on the fourth morning. I had gone out early to refill my water jugs, and when I came back, I saw boot prints on the porch. They were fresh, still outlined sharply in the dew. I stood there staring at them for a good minute, trying to understand what I was seeing. They weren't mine. Mine were hiking boots, thick tread. These were different, flatter, like work boots. I checked the ground around the cabin, but there were no other footprints in the dirt or leaves. Nothing leading in or out, just those prints on the porch right in front of the door. I looked around for a while, even checked inside the cabin with my rifle in hand. Nothing was touched, nothing missing, no signs of forced entry. I told myself maybe I had tracked in mud from earlier, or maybe I'd forgotten I walked out during the night. But it didn't sit right. The prints were too big to be mine, and I never left the cabin at night. The next day, I went further into the woods, trying to get my mind off it. I followed the creek upstream for a while, maybe a couple of miles, until I found a small waterfall. It was a beautiful spot, completely hidden in the forest. I sat there for a while, ate a granola bar, then turned to head back. That's when I saw it. A piece of fabric caught on a branch about 20 feet away. It was dark green, like part of a jacket. I walked over and pulled it loose. It looked old, weathered, but definitely man-made. There were also scratches on the tree trunk, long and deep, as if someone had dragged something metal across it. I didn't see any other signs, no backpack, no trail, nothing. When I got back to the cabin, the front door was slightly open. My heart sank. I was sure I had locked it. I always locked it. I crept up slowly, rifle raised, listening. No sound inside. I opened the door wide and stepped in, heart pounding. Everything looked normal at first. Then I saw the cooler. The lid was off. Ice melted all over the floor. Some of the food was missing, 2 cans of beans and a bag of jerky. I checked the rest of the cabin. Nothing else was taken, but I found muddy boot prints near the stove. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair with the rifle across my lap, lantern burning low. I kept thinking about the prints, the missing food, the open door. Someone had been watching me, maybe even followed me from the road. The woods were too thick to see anyone from the cabin, but they could see me. They could have been out there right then, just beyond the trees. The following morning, I packed everything valuable into the car. I planned to leave, but when I turned the key, the engine didn't even click. I opened the hood and my stomach turned. The battery was gone, completely removed. I stood there staring at the empty compartment like an idiot. Who steals a battery in the middle of nowhere? I checked the surrounding area, looked for tracks, anything. But the ground was covered in pine needles and moss. Nothing clear. That day was long. I tried to think of what to do. No phone signal, no radio. It would be a 2-day walk back to the nearest town, and I didn't feel safe leaving the cabin unattended. I kept the rifle close and stayed inside most of the time. I barely slept that night. Every time I heard a branch snap or an animal call, I sat up, heart racing. The next few days were worse. I started hearing noises at night. Not animals, footsteps, sometimes close, sometimes circling the cabin. Once, just after midnight, I heard the outhouse door slam shut. I turned off the lantern and watched through the cracks in the window. I saw nothing, just darkness, the woods swallowing everything. On the 6th night, I saw someone. I was sitting by the window, staring into the dark, when I saw movement near the edge of the tree line. A figure, tall, thin, standing perfectly still. I couldn't make out a face, just the outline. They were maybe 50 feet away, just watching, not moving. I raised the rifle and aimed, but I couldn't shoot. I didn't know what I'd be shooting at. After maybe 10 minutes, the figure turned and walked back into the woods. The next morning, I decided to risk the walk. I packed a small bag with food, water, the rifle, and started down the trail. It was early, fog still hanging in the air. I hadn't gone more than a mile when I found something hanging from a tree branch. My car battery, suspended by rope like some kind of twisted warning. There were scratches on the metal casing, deep and deliberate. My name was carved into it. I turned and ran back to the cabin. I didn't know what else to do. I barricaded the door with furniture and stayed inside the rest of the day. That night, the noises came back. Closer this time, scratching at the walls, light tapping on the windows. I didn't sleep. I didn't even blink. In the morning, everything was quiet. The woods looked calm, peaceful. I went outside slowly, checked around the cabin. That's when I saw the footprints again. Dozens of them, all around the cabin. Some barefoot, some boots, all different sizes. I realized then that it wasn't just one person. It had never been just one person. I didn't wait another day. I packed everything I could carry, grabbed the rifle, and started walking. I didn't care how long it took. I didn't stop to rest, didn't stop to drink. I walked for over 20 hours, straight through the night, until I reached a highway and flagged down a passing logging truck. The driver took me to the nearest sheriff's station. They sent a team to the cabin, but by the time they got there, it was empty. No signs of anyone. The cabin had been trashed, books shredded, furniture broken, the door hanging off its hinges. But no one was there. They never found out who it was. Locals said there were rumors about squatters or survivalist groups in those woods, people who didn't like outsiders. But nobody was arrested. Nobody ever claimed responsibility. I never got the battery back. I never went back. That week changed me. I don't go into the woods alone anymore. I don't rent remote cabins. And I never, ever ignore boot prints that don't belong to me. Because now I know when you think you're alone. It was early October when I decided to take a break from everything and drive up to a cabin I had rented in northern Montana. The stress of my job was eating at me. My phone rang constantly, and even when I got home, I was drowning in emails and late-night work. I was barely sleeping. I needed to be somewhere quiet, somewhere far. I found the cabin through a small website that listed privately owned properties in remote areas. The pictures showed a one-story wooden cabin sitting in a clearing surrounded by trees. It looked clean, simple, and most importantly, completely isolated. It was 3 miles from the nearest dirt road and about 45 minutes from the closest town. I packed up my small SUV with everything I thought I would need: clothes, a cooler full of food, water, a few books, and some tools just in case. I also brought a solar-powered battery bank, a backup power source, and a big flashlight. I printed the directions the owner sent me and made the drive up. The last half hour was rough. A winding gravel road with deep ruts, no cell service, and no signs of civilization. I had to drive slow, weaving around large rocks and fallen branches. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, it was late afternoon, and the sun had dipped low behind the treetops. The cabin looked smaller in person. Just a square building with a sloped metal roof, a small porch, and 2 windows on the front. There was no electricity, no plumbing. The bathroom was an outhouse about 30 yards behind the cabin. Inside, it was plain. A small kitchen space with a counter and shelves, a table and chair, and a single bed in the corner with a wool blanket folded on top. A wood stove sat near the wall, and a few pieces of chopped firewood were stacked beside it. The air inside smelled like old wood and dust, but I liked it. It was silent. I could hear the wind blowing through the trees outside. The first 2 days were peaceful. I spent the mornings walking around the woods nearby. I stayed on deer trails and kept track of landmarks to avoid getting lost. In the afternoons, I read or chopped more wood. I didn't see anyone, not a single person. At night, I sat on the porch and listened to the forest. There were sounds, of course, crickets, wind, maybe a distant owl, but nothing that made me uneasy. I slept well the first night. The second night, I woke up once to what sounded like a branch snapping, but it could have been an animal. I drifted back to sleep without thinking much of it. By the third night, something started to feel off. I was sitting inside around 8 p.m., using my flashlight to read one of the paperbacks I had brought, when I heard what I thought was movement outside. It was soft, but it didn't sound like wind or a small animal. It was more like shuffling, like someone slowly walking in the grass. I turned off the flashlight and sat in the dark, listening. After a few seconds, I heard it again, closer this time. Then it stopped. I stood up slowly and stepped toward the window, trying to look out, but it was pitch black beyond the glass. The trees were too dense, and without moonlight or nearby light sources, I couldn't see anything. I stayed like that for almost 5 minutes, holding my breath and trying not to move. I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, I convinced myself it was a deer or maybe a raccoon. I turned the flashlight back on and went back to reading, but I couldn't focus. Every few minutes, I paused and listened. There was nothing else that night, but I barely slept. I kept waking up at the slightest noise. The next morning, I walked around the clearing looking for signs of something. I saw nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing unusual. I kept telling myself it had to be some animal. The woods were full of them. That afternoon, I tried to relax. I cooked a small meal on the portable stove I had brought, chopped more wood, and cleaned up inside the cabin. As the sun began to go down, I lit a candle and kept the flashlight close. That night, around the same time, I heard the sound again. This time it was louder. It came from the side of the cabin, near the window by the bed. It sounded like someone moving slowly through the leaves. I turned off the candle and listened. The sound stopped for a minute, then started again. It moved around the cabin. First one side, then the back. I stood completely still, gripping the flashlight. My heart was pounding. I didn't want to open the door. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. It felt like whoever or whatever was out there knew I was inside. And they weren't in a hurry. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. I waited another hour before lighting the candle again. I barely slept that night either. Every time I heard a creak or shift of wind, I jolted awake. When morning came, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. Again, I found nothing, but this time something felt different. It was in the air, pressure, like being watched. I kept glancing behind me even though I was alone. By now, I was more alert. I carried my hatchet with me anytime I stepped outside. I debated leaving, but the nearest town was almost an hour away, and the road was too rough to drive at night. I figured I'd leave first thing in the morning if anything else happened. I tried to stay calm and spent the day writing in a notebook and keeping busy. That night, I didn't light a candle. I stayed in the dark with the flashlight on my lap and listened. I didn't have to wait long. Around 9 p.m., I heard the movement again. But this time, there were multiple sets of footsteps. I heard one to the left of the cabin, another to the right. They were slow, careful. I sat frozen. The sound of leaves shifting, twigs snapping lightly under pressure. One of them stopped right outside the wall near the kitchen. Another one circled toward the back. I wanted to grab my keys and run for the car, but it was parked about 50 yards from the cabin, beyond the trees. There was no way I'd make it in the dark without being seen. I waited, heart racing, sweat dripping down my neck. Suddenly, there was a sound against the wall, like a fingernail or knife dragging lightly across the wood. Scraped slowly, then stopped. Then again. I backed away toward the bed, holding the flashlight like a weapon. The sounds continued for almost 20 minutes. Walking, stopping, scraping, walking again. I never heard voices, just movement. Then slowly they faded away. I didn't sleep at all. I sat on the bed with the flashlight pointed at the door until daylight started to break through the window. That morning, I packed everything. I didn't care how bad the road was. I stuffed everything into the back of the SUV, double-checked that I hadn't left anything behind, and locked the cabin door out of habit. As I walked toward the car, I scanned the woods constantly, looking for movement. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I got to the car, I opened the driver's side door and froze. There were scratches, long, deep scratches running down the side of the vehicle. Not just a few, dozens. They looked like they had been made by a knife or something sharp. The paint was gouged out, metal showing beneath. I walked around the car and found more on the back, even on the windows. My heart dropped. I got in, started the engine, and drove. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. Once I had cell service again, I called the owner of the cabin. I told him someone had been outside the cabin for multiple nights, that I had heard them, that they scratched my car, and that I was leaving early. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in a flat voice, that he understood and would refund part of my payment. That was it. I never went back. Weeks later, I was back at home, trying to move on from the experience. I had the scratches on my SUV buffed out and tried not to think about it too much. But one day, out of curiosity, I searched for the listing again. The cabin was gone from the site. No trace of it. I tried searching the owner's name, nothing. I even tried tracing the address using maps, but the satellite view only showed thick forest. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted or why they waited outside for hours without doing anything more. Maybe they were trying to scare me. Maybe they were planning something worse. But I never found out, and I never will. What I do know is this: there are places out there where people go missing without explanation. Places where help is too far, and the silence hides more than just trees and wind. That cabin was one of those places, and I was lucky to leave it when I did. I rented the cabin to be alone, not to escape from the world exactly, but to step away for a while and be with nothing but silence. I had started to feel the weight of everything, the city noise, the work stress, the phone always buzzing. The cabin was deep in the woods of northern Michigan. It was an old, single-story structure with a small front porch, a tin roof, and just enough modern additions to make it livable. A propane heater, a small generator, a compost toilet. There was no cell service out there, no Wi-Fi. That was part of the appeal. I arrived just before sunset. The dirt road was bumpy and narrow, with tall trees leaning in from both sides. It looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. I had rented the place online from an older man who said he used to take his kids out there during summers. He lived in Florida now. All I needed was a key code to a lockbox. That gave me a weird feeling, just walking into someone else's memories like that. But I figured it was no different from any rental. The inside was dusty and smelled like wood and mildew. There was one bedroom, a small kitchen, a wood stove, and a single window above the sink that looked out into the trees. No curtains, no blinds. The only other window was in the bedroom, but it was small and cloudy. I didn't mind the dust. I unpacked, filled a jug of water from the big plastic container I brought with me, and sat on the porch to watch the sun drop. That first night was calm. It got cold fast once the sun went down, so I lit the stove, unrolled my sleeping bag, and settled on the old couch. I brought a book with me but couldn't focus. I just stared at the flames and listened. It was so quiet that even the ticking of the old wall clock seemed loud. I fell asleep earlier than I expected. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound. It was subtle, barely more than a scrape. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but when I sat up, I heard it again. A slow, dragging sound across the wooden porch. Then it stopped. I didn't move. My breath felt heavy in my chest. I waited. Nothing. After a while, I convinced myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer brushing up against the porch. The forest was full of them. I stayed awake for maybe another hour, just listening, before I finally fell back asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and checked the porch. I saw what looked like a faint smear of dirt along one of the steps. It could have been anything. A boot scuff from the last person, a raccoon with muddy paws. I told myself it didn't matter. I made coffee on my portable stove, sat on the porch again, and tried to relax. It was what I came here for. The day passed slowly. I went for a short walk along a trail that cut through the woods behind the cabin. The trees were dense and old, and the trail was barely visible in places. It didn't feel like a place many people used anymore. I marked a few trees with bits of orange string from my backpack so I wouldn't lose my way. After maybe 2 hours, I turned back. The cabin looked smaller and darker when I came back into view. That second night, it rained. I liked the sound of the drops hitting the tin roof, but the wind picked up hard around midnight. It made the trees groan. At one point, something slammed against the side of the cabin. I flinched. It sounded heavy. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. I scanned the trees, the porch, the side of the house. Nothing, just wet leaves and dark woods. I stood there for too long, feeling the rain soak into my hoodie. Finally, I went back in and bolted the door. I didn't sleep well. My dreams were restless, full of trees and shadows. I woke up sweating even though the cabin was cold. When morning finally came, I felt drained. I tried to brush it off, told myself it was just the quiet getting to me. But when I stepped outside, something was different. At the edge of the trees, maybe 50 feet from the cabin, I saw marks in the dirt. Long, straight lines that didn't look natural. I walked closer. The lines were about 3 feet long, like someone had dragged a metal pole or maybe a heavy stick across the dirt. But there was no other sign, no prints, no broken branches. Just those drag marks crossing in different directions. That whole day I felt watched. I know how that sounds, but it was like the air had changed. I couldn't sit still. I tried reading again, then pacing. I kept glancing at the window above the sink. At one point, I thought I saw something move between the trees, but when I rushed outside, nothing was there. I didn't leave the porch for the rest of the day. I brought a hatchet with me for splitting firewood. That night, I kept it next to the couch. I didn't light the stove. I didn't want the glow to be seen from outside. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the door. Then I heard it again. That same dragging sound, slower this time, and closer. It started from the woods and moved toward the porch. Then it stopped. I held my breath. I thought about turning on the flashlight, but didn't want to give myself away. Then I heard a new sound, softer, but worse somehow. A creak from the porch. I got up, still holding the hatchet, and stood near the door. I couldn't see through it. No peephole. I waited for what felt like forever, but nothing else happened. No knock, no footsteps, just silence. I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch all night, watching the door. In the morning, I found scratches on the frame, deep ones, like someone had pressed something sharp against the wood and pulled down hard. For lines, evenly spaced. It didn't look like claws, it looked like a tool. I packed my things that day. I wanted to leave, but my rental car had issues. The battery was dead. I don't know how. I hadn't used it since I got there. I popped the hood, checked the cables, they looked fine. I tried jump-starting it with the emergency battery pack I brought. Nothing. I felt trapped. I spent that afternoon inside, watching the trees. No more movement, no sounds, just dead calm. When the sun started to go down, I closed the curtains I had improvised using duct tape and garbage bags from the kitchen. I lit the stove this time. The cold was too much. I placed the hatchet on the table. Then I grabbed a knife from the kitchen drawer and kept it in my hoodie pocket. I couldn't take the silence anymore, so I turned on the small radio I brought. It was mostly static, but I picked up a faint signal from somewhere. It was talk radio, angry voices arguing about politics. I left it on low. Then around midnight, the generator cut off. The radio went silent. The light bulb over the stove went dark. I froze. My heart felt like it stopped. I waited. Then I heard it again. That dragging sound. This time it came from behind the cabin. From the side where there were no windows. It circled slowly around. I could hear it scraping softly across the dirt, the wooden steps. Then another creak on the porch. I picked up the hatchet and stood in the center of the room. I didn't care if they saw me now. I just wanted it to stop. I held my breath. Nothing happened for a long time. Then finally a knock. Just one. Hard. Then silence again. I stayed standing until morning. When daylight came, I stepped outside. The marks in the dirt were everywhere. Lines, circles, deep, unnatural grooves. The scratches on the door had doubled. I tried the car again. This time it started. I didn't pack the rest of my things. I just drove. I never found out who it was or what they wanted. I reported the cabin listing when I got back, but the site said the user account had already been deleted. I checked satellite maps. The road to that place didn't even show up clearly, just forest. I still think about those marks, the sounds, the knocking. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. It was someone real, someone who had been there before and knew the woods better than I ever could. And I think, if my car hadn't started that morning, I wouldn't have made it out. I haven't been back to the woods since. It was early September when I decided to take some time off from work. I was burnt out and tired of the same daily routine. I needed a break from city noise, phones ringing, car horns, and staring at screens all day. I booked a small cabin up north, deep in the woods near a lake I used to fish at when I was a teenager. The cabin was owned by an older man who mostly rented it out to hunters and hikers. It was simple: one bedroom, a kitchen, a fireplace, and no internet. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive there took almost 5 hours. Most of it was paved highway, but the last hour was slow, dirt roads and gravel trails. I passed some empty fields, thick pine forests, and a couple of broken down trailers. I didn't see many people around, which was fine. I was looking for isolation. When I finally arrived, the cabin sat quiet in a small clearing surrounded by thick trees. It looked just like the photos online. The porch sagged a little. The roof was slightly tilted, but everything was in one piece. The air smelled like pine and old wood. The only sounds were birds and the occasional rustling leaves. Inside, it was basic but clean. There was an old couch near the fireplace, a small dining table with 2 chairs, and a bed with a thick wool blanket in the corner. I put my backpack down, opened the windows to air the place out, and sat down on the front porch. For a while, I just listened. It felt good to hear nothing but wind and trees. That first night, I made a simple dinner, just canned soup and crackers. After I ate, I sat by the fireplace with a book. I didn't read much. My eyes felt heavy from the long drive and fresh air. I went to bed early and slept hard. No alarms, no traffic, just the sound of the wind. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. I boiled some water for coffee, stepped outside, and stood barefoot on the porch. The ground was cold. The sky was still dark, but I could hear the birds waking up. Felt peaceful. Later in the morning, I took a walk around the area. There was a faint trail behind the cabin that led through the woods. It hadn't been used much. Grass and small branches covered most of it. I followed it for maybe half an hour until I reached a small hill. At the top, there was an old lookout spot. You could see down toward the lake, though the trees blocked most of the view now. I sat on a rock and stayed there for a while. Everything felt still. I didn't see any animals, just birds. No other hikers, no boats on the lake. Just me and the woods. Back at the cabin, I spent the rest of the day doing nothing. I cooked some eggs, chopped some firewood, and cleaned the place up a little. The next couple of days passed slowly like that. Quiet walks, simple meals, long naps. But by the 4th day, I noticed something that made me feel a little off. It was early morning. I had just finished making coffee. When I stepped outside, I saw boot prints in the dirt near the edge of the clearing. They weren't mine. I always walked with sneakers, and these prints were clearly from heavy boots. They were fresh, too. I bent down and looked at them closely. The soil was still damp underneath. It hadn't rained the night before, so someone must have walked by early that morning or late the night before. I looked around but didn't see anyone. The woods were quiet like always. Maybe it was just someone hiking through, but the trail was barely visible, and the cabin wasn't exactly on the way to anywhere. I tried to brush it off, but it stayed in the back of my mind. The next day, I found more boot prints. This time, they were closer to the cabin. One set near the back window, another near the porch. That made me nervous. I checked the doors and windows, but nothing seemed touched. I still felt uneasy. I started keeping a fire going at night, more for comfort than warmth. The glow made the inside feel safer, but I slept lightly, waking up at every creak or pop of wood. I started noticing other things, too. Small ones, but enough to add up. Once I found a cigarette, but near the woodpile. I don't smoke, Another time, one of the porch chairs had been moved slightly. Not far, just enough that I noticed. One morning, I went outside and saw something that stopped me cold. A small dead bird, neatly placed on the steps of the porch. Its neck had been twisted, but there was no blood. No sign of an animal attack, just placed there. I stared at it for a long time. Then I picked it up with a stick and tossed it deep into the woods. That same night, I heard movement outside. It was just after midnight. The fire was still burning low. I had left one window cracked open for air. That's when I heard slow footsteps on the leaves. Not an animal's steps. These were heavy, deliberate. I sat up in bed and held my breath. The footsteps stopped. I waited. Then I heard a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged along the side of the cabin. I grabbed the small axe I had used for firewood. I crept toward the window and looked out. I didn't see anything. The firelight cast shadows on the ground, but nothing moved. After a while, I didn't hear anything else. I stayed awake for the rest of the night. The next morning, I walked around the cabin. I found long scratch marks on the sidewall, about waist high. Not claw marks. These were long and straight, like someone had dragged a metal object along the wood. I packed my things that day. I had booked the cabin for 10 days, but I left on the 6th. On the way out, I stopped at the small gas station near the highway. I told the old man at the counter about what happened. He just looked at me, didn't say anything, and rang up my coffee. I never went back to that cabin. A few weeks later, I checked the website where I had booked the place. The listing was gone. I searched for the owner's name, but there was nothing. No phone number, no record of the place. It was like it had vanished. I still think about those boot prints sometimes. Whoever it was, they never tried to break in. They never showed themselves, but they were there, watching, maybe just curious, maybe waiting. That trip changed how I feel about being alone in the woods. I used to find peace in the silence. Now, silence makes me listen harder, makes me wonder what's hiding behind the trees. I don't go camping much anymore, and if I do, I make sure I'm never too far from other people. Nothing ever happened to me physically. I didn't get hurt. I didn't see a face, but I knew I wasn't alone, and that's enough, because sometimes the worst danger isn't what jumps out at you. It's what stays just out of sight, waiting for you to let your guard down. It was the second week of October when I drove up to the cabin. I had rented it for a full 2 weeks, hoping to get some peace and quiet after quitting my job. I had worked 10 years in an office that drained me every day, sitting in a cubicle with no windows, dealing with numbers and spreadsheets, drinking cheap coffee and watching the hours crawl by. I wasn't exactly burned out, but I was tired in a way I couldn't explain. I just needed time away from people, from noise, from everything. The cabin was located deep in the northern part of Minnesota, almost 2 hours from the nearest town. I found it on a rental website that listed remote places for people like me, people who didn't want to be found. It wasn't fancy, just a small wooden structure with 1 bedroom, a kitchen, a living area with a wood stove, and a tiny bathroom with a rust-stained sink and a toilet that flushed slowly. There was no TV, no internet, no phone service. Just the woods and the cold, clear air. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive there had been long and silent. I had brought all my supplies with me. Canned food, bottled water, a few frozen meals in a cooler, some instant coffee, a couple of books, my sleeping bag, a flashlight, and an old hunting knife I had owned for years. I didn't plan on hunting or hiking too far, but I felt safer having it. You never know what kind of animals you might run into that deep in the woods. The first few days were exactly what I needed. I woke up with the sunrise, made a simple breakfast, and sat on the porch drinking coffee and listening to the wind move through the trees. The leaves were starting to turn orange and red, and at night, the air had a bite to it. I stayed bundled up, lighting the wood stove to keep the chill out of the cabin. I read my books, took naps in the afternoon, and sometimes walked down the dirt trail that led away from the cabin. I never went far, just enough to stretch my legs and take in the quiet. But around the 4th day, I started to notice small things that felt off. Nothing big, Nothing obvious, just small things. The first was a boot print by the steps leading up to the porch. It wasn't mine. I had thick tread hiking boots, and this print was smoother with a worn heel. It looked old at first, maybe left behind by whoever cleaned the place before I arrived. But when I checked the next morning, there was another one. Same print. This one was fresher. I didn't panic, but it made me uneasy. I told myself it was probably a local hunter passing through. Still, I started locking the door at night and keeping the hunting knife close. I even blocked the door with a chair before going to bed, just in case. It seemed a little paranoid, but I was alone in the middle of nowhere, and something about that second boot print bothered me more than I wanted to admit. On the fifth night, I heard something. It was close to midnight, and I was in bed half asleep, when a thud against the wall jolted me awake. Just one thud, like something heavy had bumped against the side of the cabin. I stayed still, holding my breath, listening. I heard nothing after that. No footsteps, no rustling, just the wind outside. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, clutching the knife in one hand. The next morning, I walked around the cabin. I found nothing unusual. No marks on the wall, no tracks in the dirt. But I noticed something else. The firewood stack had been moved. It wasn't obvious, but I remembered how I stacked it. Now, a few logs were missing and the pile looked slightly lower. I had only used wood from the top, never touched the bottom. Someone had taken from the bottom. That day, I stayed alert. I kept the knife in my pocket even when I was inside. I didn't go on my usual walk. I sat on the porch most of the day, watching the trees. I felt like someone was nearby, watching me back. Every time a twig snapped or a squirrel darted by, my heart jumped. The silence that once felt peaceful now felt heavy. That night, I barely slept. I kept the lamp on, though it made the cabin feel strange and shadowy. I heard nothing unusual, but I couldn't relax. I started thinking about the people who might live in the area. Maybe someone didn't like me being there. Maybe they thought I was trespassing. I had no way of knowing. I had no phone, no radio, no contact with the outside world. On the seventh day, something changed. I woke up and saw something strange on the porch. It was a dead squirrel. Its neck was broken, and it had been placed neatly by the door. That scared me more than anything else so far. Animals die in the woods all the time, but they don't end up laid out neatly on people's porches. This was a message. Someone wanted me to know they were there. I packed up my things. I threw everything into the duffel bag, grabbed my knife, and loaded the cooler back into my car. I decided to leave. I couldn't take it anymore. I had come for peace, but now I felt like prey. I locked the cabin behind me even though I was sure it didn't matter. I got into the car, turned the key, and nothing happened. The engine didn't even click. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood and checked the battery. The cables had been cut. Clean, straight cuts. Someone had done it during the night. That's when I felt real fear. Not the nervous kind, but the deep, shaking kind. My heart thudded in my ears, and I started to sweat despite the cold air. I didn't know what to do. There was no signal, and the nearest town was hours away by foot. I had no bike, no radio, just trees in every direction. I went back inside the cabin, bolted the door, and pulled the chair under the handle again. I sat with my back against the wall, watching the windows, the knife resting in my lap. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the corner with a blanket wrapped around me, every light on. Just before sunrise, I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy steps. They stopped right outside the door. I didn't move. I barely breathed. After a few seconds, the handle turned. They tried to open the door. I had locked it, and the chair held it in place. The handle rattled a bit more, then silence. I waited. After what felt like forever, I heard the steps move away. I didn't dare look out the window until full daylight. When I finally did, no one was there, but the dead squirrel was gone. That morning, I took my backpack, stuffed in some food, water, and my knife and started walking. I locked the cabin and headed south, following the dirt trail I had walked before. I didn't stop. I walked for hours, watching behind me every few minutes. Every noise made me jump. Around late afternoon, I reached a small roadside gas station. It was closed, but there was a payphone. I called the local sheriff's office and waited. When they arrived, I explained everything. They didn't find anyone at the cabin, but they did confirm that someone had been there. They found the cut cables, the boot prints, even some strange markings carved into a tree behind the cabin. Not symbols, just long cuts in the bark, like someone had been sharpening a blade or testing a knife. I never found out who it was. The sheriff said it was probably someone living off-grid nearby, maybe unstable. He told me I was lucky I left when I did. That night, I stayed at a motel in town, and I couldn't sleep even with the TV on and the door locked. I never went back to the cabin. I didn't even ask for a refund. I just wanted to forget it. But even now, sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I hear footsteps outside my window. What scared me the most wasn't that someone had been there. It was how quiet they were, how careful, how they never tried to break in while I was awake. They waited, they watched, they planned. And if I hadn't left when I did, I honestly don't know what would have happened. That kind of silence sticks with you, changes how you hear the world. I went there looking for peace. Instead, I found something worse than noise. I found someone who liked the quiet even more than I did. It was early October when I decided to take a break from everything and head up to a cabin I'd rented deep in the Montana woods. I had found the place online, and it was marketed as a quiet escape for hunters or anyone needing solitude. The listing showed pictures of a plain log cabin surrounded by thick trees, a small fire pit in front, and no visible neighbors for miles. It was just what I was looking for. I'd been feeling worn out lately, mentally, emotionally, and physically, and something about being out there alone seemed like the reset I needed. I drove up from Bozeman, the highway winding through golden fields before giving way to forest roads. The last 20 miles were gravel, and the farther I got, the less cell service I had. Eventually, my signal dropped completely. The road narrowed until it was just a single lane with trees pushing in from both sides. It felt like I was being swallowed up by the forest. I liked that feeling at first. It was quiet, peaceful. I rolled down the window and breathed in the cold, pine-scented air. When I pulled up to the cabin, it looked just like the pictures. Maybe a little older, a little more weathered. The porch sagged slightly at the corners, and the wood looked gray from years of sun and snow. But it was solid. There was a padlock on the front door, just like the owner said there would be, and a key hidden under a fake rock by the steps. I let myself in, dropped my bags, and walked around the one-room cabin. There was a cot in one corner, a wood stove in another, and a small table with 2 chairs. A few shelves held basic supplies, canned food, candles, some old matches, and a flashlight with fading batteries. There was no plumbing, no electricity, and no cell signal. It was perfect. The first day passed slowly. I chopped some firewood from the pile out back and carried it in. I unpacked my food, made a sandwich, and sat on the porch for a while just listening to the forest. Every now and then, a bird called out or a squirrel darted across the ground. The wind made the trees sway and creak, and when the sun went down, the temperature dropped fast. I lit a fire in the wood stove and huddled near it with a book I'd brought. After a while, I fell asleep in the cot with the crackle of firewood fading behind me. That night was the last good night of sleep I had during that trip. The next morning, I woke up early. The air inside the cabin was cold, my breath coming out in little clouds. I got the fire going again and made some instant coffee. I planned to hike a little, maybe look for a spot to fish. There was a small stream about a mile downhill, and I wanted to explore the area. I spent most of the day out there, walking the narrow trails and weaving between trees. I saw some deer tracks, heard a few distant calls I couldn't identify. Around mid-afternoon, I found the stream and followed it for a while. It was shallow but fast-moving, with crystal-clear water running over rocks and moss. I sat on a boulder and let the sound of the water fill my head. When I made it back to the cabin, the sun was already low. I was dirty, tired, and ready to eat. I heated up a can of chili on the wood stove, ate it with crackers, and sat outside until it got too cold. Then I went inside, locked the door, and settled into bed. That night, I kept waking up. I wasn't sure why. At first, I thought it was the cold, but the fire was still going and I was bundled in 2 blankets. Every time I dozed off, I would hear something. At first, I thought it was the trees. The wind would pick up, and the old logs of the cabin would creak. But this sounded different, more deliberate. It was a kind of thump, faint but steady, like something hitting wood, then waiting a while, then hitting again. I sat up, straining to hear. It would stop for a long time, and just when I thought it was gone, it would start again. It didn't sound like an animal. It didn't sound like wind. I got up and opened the door. The porch was dark, and my flashlight was too dim to see past the first line of trees. I stood there for a minute, listening. Nothing. I went back in and tried to convince myself it was all in my head. I locked the door again and went back to bed. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. I didn't see anything out of place. No animal tracks, no fallen branches. Just the same old leaves and pine needles covering the ground. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I was just on edge from being alone for the first time in a while. But that night, the noise came back. Louder, more frequent. I didn't sleep much. I stayed up most of the night, sitting near the fire with the flashlight in my hand. Every time I heard the thumping, I turned the light toward the wall it seemed to come from, but I never saw anything. By the 4th day, I was running low on sleep. I hadn't seen another person since I got there, and I started feeling like something was watching me. Not in a crazy way, just in a deep, instinctive way that made the back of my neck tense up. I'd sit outside and scan the trees for any movement. I started keeping the axe inside the cabin with me, propped up next to the bed. That afternoon, I found something that made everything worse. I was out gathering kindling and wandered a bit farther than usual. Maybe a 1/4 mile from the cabin, I found what looked like an old tree stand. It was nailed into a dead pine about 15 feet off the ground. It didn't look like it had been used in years. The wood was gray and rotten, but under it, I saw something that made my stomach drop. There were footprints, not animal, human, just one set. They were deep, meaning whoever made them was heavy or carrying something. And they were fresh. The ground was soft from the rain the night before, and these prints were clean with sharp edges. They led from the base of the tree back toward the cabin. Not toward any road, not toward a trail, just toward where I was staying. I backed away slowly, trying not to make noise. I kept looking over my shoulder the whole walk back. I felt exposed, like someone could see me, but I couldn't see them. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the door and pulled the curtains shut. I didn't go outside again that day. That night, it wasn't just thumping I heard. It was crunching, footsteps, outside the cabin. Not fast, slow, like someone circling. I held the axe in one hand and the flashlight in the other. I stayed like that until dawn. I didn't open the door. I didn't sleep. In the morning, I finally worked up the courage to step outside. I found more footprints. They circled the cabin. They were all around the porch, by the windows. Someone had been there, walking in slow, looping patterns around where I was sleeping. I saw a mark on one of the windows where a hand had wiped away the dirt to look inside. That was it. I packed up everything I could carry. I left the rest. I didn't care anymore. I needed to leave. The hike back to my car took over an hour, and the whole time I felt like I was being watched. I kept hearing twigs snap behind me, but every time I looked, I saw nothing. I finally reached my car, unlocked it, and threw my stuff in. I drove away as fast as I could without wrecking the car on the gravel road. When I reached a spot with cell service, I pulled over and called the sheriff's office. I told them what happened, and they said they'd send someone out to check. I never heard back. A week later, I got a call from the owner of the cabin. He said the deputies had gone out there but didn't find anything unusual. He asked if I wanted a partial refund since I had left early. I told him to keep it. That was the last time I went looking for solitude in the woods. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm lying in bed at night and hear a strange sound. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I know what I heard. I know what I saw, and I know I'm never going back. started with a simple idea. I wanted to get away for a while. Not in the usual sense, not some loud vacation or a fancy hotel. I just wanted silence. Complete, isolated silence. The kind you only get in the middle of nowhere. So I looked online for a cabin. Not one close to town. Not one near a tourist spot. Something deep. Something forgotten. I found it on a sketchy-looking website. The cabin was listed by a guy who said he inherited it from his uncle. He barely used it, didn't like the cold. He told me it was an hour and a half north of a town I'd never heard of. I didn't care. The pictures showed a rundown but standing wooden cabin, with tall trees surrounding it like guards. I booked it for a week. I packed light, just the basics. Some canned food, water, sleeping bag, flashlight, a small axe, and a couple of books. No electronics besides my phone, and even that I planned on turning off once I arrived. I wanted to clear my head. I figured a week of silence and forest air would do it. The drive was long. After passing the last gas station, it was just dirt roads and thin trails. My car rattled over roots and stones. I lost signal about 40 minutes in. That part made me nervous, but I kept going. The directions the guy gave me were handwritten and vague, but I followed them carefully. I got there in the late afternoon. The sun was still above the trees, but just barely. The cabin looked older than in the pictures. The wood was darker, more worn. Some of the corners were rotting. The front steps creaked like they'd snap. But the door opened, the roof held, and it was dry inside. That was all I needed. Inside was small. One room, a small counter with a sink that didn't work, a wood-burning stove, a chair, and a cot. No electricity, no plumbing. The guy wasn't kidding when he said it was untouched. I liked it, felt real. I unloaded my things and set up my sleeping bag on the cot. The sun dropped fast. By 7 p.m., the woods were already black. I lit a few candles and tried to read, but the silence was heavy. I'd expected that, but it still pressed on me. There were sounds outside, though. Not creepy, just forest stuff. Wind, branches, maybe small animals. It was fine. I went to sleep early. The first night was cold. I woke up a few times because of it. I heard something scratching against the cabin once, maybe a branch, maybe an animal. I didn't get up to check. It didn't feel serious. I stayed in my sleeping bag and tried to sleep. The next morning, I walked around the area. There wasn't much, just trees, miles of them. I found a narrow stream about 15 minutes away. The water looked clean, so I filled a bottle and boiled it back at the cabin. I chopped some wood with the small axe. It wasn't hard, but it made me sweat. I ate cold beans and sat on the steps for a while. Felt peaceful. That night, something changed. I was lying in the sleeping bag, eyes closed, not asleep yet. I heard something, not forest sounds. It was a click, like wood tapping on wood, slow and spaced out. It sounded like it was coming from the side of the cabin. I stayed quiet. It went on for a while. Then it stopped. I heard a small rustling, then nothing. I stayed awake longer than I meant to. Eventually, I fell asleep. In the morning, I walked around the cabin. I checked the walls. There were marks, not deep but clear. Scratches, thin and long, some curved, like something had been drawn or etched into the wood with a stick or a knife. I touched one. It was fresh, could have been kids, but this cabin was too far, too deep. There weren't any other cars when I came in. No trails, no signs. It would have taken effort to get here. I shook it off and tried to ignore it. The third day was cloudy, felt colder, damper. I spent most of the day inside reading and keeping the fire going. I didn't go back to the stream. I just boiled some of the water I already had. I ate less. My stomach didn't feel great. That night, I heard the tapping again. Same sound, same rhythm. Tap, pause, tap, pause. It stopped again. I waited. Then I heard a different sound. It was slower, a soft brushing like something being dragged. It went from one side of the cabin to the other. I didn't move. My flashlight was under the cot. I reached for it slowly and turned it on. Pointed it at the door. Nothing. The walls held. Nothing came in. I didn't sleep much. I started keeping the axe next to me. Day 4 was windy. Trees moved like they were whispering. I didn't leave the cabin. I watched the woods from the window. Nothing moved in the trees, but I didn't feel calm. I was jumpy. My eyes twitched at shadows. That evening, I heard the sound again, but this time it was on the roof. Tap, pause, tap, pause. I stared at the ceiling. Then a few heavier steps. Not animal steps. They were too deliberate, too slow. Then the tapping again. I thought about running to the car, but it was dark, and the trail was rough. I'd never make it without tripping or getting lost. I stayed. In the morning, I checked the roof from the side. Couldn't see much. No footprints, but the roof was slanted and dirty. If someone was up there, they didn't leave a sign. I saw something else, though, in the dirt near the back of the cabin. A print, a shoe print. Not a boot, not a hiker's tread. Just a plain sneaker, deep in the mud, facing the cabin. My heart dropped. I hadn't worn sneakers. I stared at it for a while, then stepped back inside. I locked the door, even though the lock was old and weak. I moved the cot in front of it. That day passed slow. I kept checking the windows. I saw nothing, but that night I didn't hear the tapping. I heard breathing, close, right outside the wall. Low, steady breathing. I held my breath, trying to listen. It lasted for maybe a minute. Then it stopped. I stayed up till dawn. Day 6, I decided to leave early. I packed my things fast. I planned to wait till noon, when the sun would be highest, and drive out. I didn't want to run into someone on the trail. Around 11 a.m., I heard footsteps outside. Not running, just walking, slow. I didn't move. Then they stopped near the door. I waited. Nothing happened. No knock, no voice, just silence. Then, after a while, more footsteps. They walked away. I waited 10 more minutes, then pushed the cot aside and stepped out. The woods looked normal, bright, empty. I looked at the ground. No prints, no sign, but I didn't care. I got in the car and started it. The drive out was quiet, too quiet. I kept checking the rearview mirror. Trees passed by, nothing behind me. I reached the gas station 2 hours later and stopped. I went inside. People were there. I wanted to cry. I didn't tell anyone. What would I say? I wasn't attacked. I wasn't hurt, but something was out there. Something watching, waiting. Not an animal, not a ghost, just someone, person, with time, with patience. And they liked that I didn't know where they were. I never went back. I didn't ask for a refund. I deleted the guy's messages. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe he did. I still wake up sometimes, thinking I hear that tapping. I'd been looking forward to getting away for months. Life back in the city had been chewing away at me in a way I didn't even notice until I started snapping at coworkers and feeling tired even when I woke up. I'd rented this cabin in the mountains of northern Idaho through a listing that didn't even have that many pictures. But the price was right, and it was far from everyone and everything I knew. That's all I wanted. It was early October, that perfect time when the days were still warm if the sun was out, and the nights just cold enough that the smell of pine and earth felt stronger in the air. The drive out there was long. The last few hours took me on gravel and dirt roads that didn't even show up on my GPS. I had downloaded the maps in advance, just in case. The cabin sat alone in a clearing surrounded by thick trees, backed by a steep hill and facing a little valley. The listing said there were neighbors within 5 miles, but I didn't see anyone. No cabins in view, no roads, nothing, just trees and silence. I got there in the late afternoon. The place wasn't fancy, just a single floor, wooden structure with a slanted tin roof, a narrow front porch, and a shed behind it. No Wi-Fi, no TV, electricity from a solar array on the roof, water from a pump just off the porch. The inside was cozy in a rugged way, wood everywhere, a small fireplace, a single bedroom with a lumpy double bed, a basic kitchen, a tiny bathroom that smelled a little musty but clean enough. I unpacked and settled in fast. I didn't bring much. Some books, a flashlight, clothes, a battery pack, and some dried food. The idea was to disconnect completely for a week. No people, No work, just quiet. The first night passed quietly. I sat on the porch for hours just listening to the wind in the trees and the occasional snap of a twig in the forest. There were no cars, no planes overhead, just complete stillness. At some point, I went inside, lit the fireplace with some chopped wood stacked neatly beside it, and fell asleep on the couch with the heat washing over me. The weirdness didn't start until the second day. I woke up early and decided to hike around the area. I didn't bring any heavy gear because I planned on staying near the cabin. I followed a faint trail that led from behind the cabin, up into the trees. It curved along the edge of a ridge and followed a dried-up creek bed. About an hour in, I realized I hadn't seen any signs of animals. No tracks, no squirrels, no birds, just the wind and the trees. That wasn't completely odd for that area and time of year, but it was enough to make me notice. I found a strange spot about 2 miles out. A tree had fallen across the trail, and under it was a small pile of bones. Animal bones, probably. They were old and sun-bleached, but they had been arranged in a sort of circle. Not perfect, just oddly deliberate. I don't know why, but it gave me a bad feeling, so I turned back and made my way to the cabin. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The fire kept going out, and I kept waking up cold. Around midnight, I thought I heard movement outside the cabin. Just once. A short rustling sound like something shifting its weight just beyond the wall. But when I got up and looked out the window, there was nothing. No moon that night, just dark sky and tall black trees. I told myself it was probably wind, maybe a deer, and went back to bed. Took a long time to fall asleep. By the third day, I started noticing small things that didn't feel right. First, my boots were wet when I woke up. Not soaked, just damp inside like they'd been out in dew, even though I'd left them by the fireplace the night before. Then I found the door to the shed out back slightly open. I hadn't been in there yet. When I looked inside, it was mostly empty. Just a few rusted tools, some firewood, and a broken lawn chair. The floor was dusty, and I noticed a single footprint near the back, too big to be mine and pressed deep, like someone heavy had stood there. It was odd but not alarming yet. That evening, I started hearing things. Soft clicks, small thuds, a scraping noise once, always far off, always from outside. I kept telling myself it was the wind or maybe a branch falling somewhere. But there was no wind. The trees stood perfectly still. I stayed inside, built up the fire, and kept my flashlight next to me. I didn't sleep much that night either. The next morning, I stepped out and saw that something had walked around the cabin during the night. The dirt was soft from the rain that had come briefly just before sunrise. I could see faint impressions. Not full footprints, just disturbances in the pine needles and mud circling the structure.
No shoe prints.
Just vague, shifting marks, like someone dragging their feet slowly in a wide path. I walked the whole perimeter, heart pounding, scanning the trees for movement. Nothing. I went back inside and locked the door. That afternoon, I seriously considered packing up and leaving early. But I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe I just scared myself. Maybe it was a bear, even though there were no clear prints. Maybe it was nothing. So I stayed. On the 5th day, things got worse. I had just finished eating some oatmeal when I noticed the front door was unlocked. I always locked it, every single time. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at the knob like it had betrayed me. I checked all the windows, still latched. I checked the shed door closed now, still empty. Then I checked my bag and realized that my battery pack was gone. It had been in the bottom of the backpack. No reason to touch it, but it wasn't there. I searched the entire cabin, every drawer, every shelf, even the crawl space under the porch. Nothing. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I stayed on the couch with my flashlight in hand, heart beating fast at every noise. I didn't light the fireplace. I didn't want anything to make light from inside. I just sat and listened. I started hearing noises again, closer this time. A tapping sound on the back wall. Then silence. Then something brushing against the corner of the cabin. A minute passed. Then 2. Then a creak. Something stepped on the porch. I held my breath and listened harder. Another creak. Then nothing. I stayed like that until sunrise. When the light finally came through the windows, I went outside. Nothing there. No marks on the porch. No sign of anything. But I was done. I decided right then to leave a day early. I didn't care if I lost money on the last night. I wanted out. I packed everything, double-checked the cabin, loaded my bag into the car, and turned the key. The engine didn't start. It didn't even click. Just silence. I tried again. Still nothing. I opened the hood. I don't know much about engines, but even I could see the battery was gone. Just gone. The cables were dangling loose. No signs of cuts or damage, just removed. I stood there for what felt like forever. I had no phone service. The battery pack was gone.
No landline.
No neighbors nearby. I was stuck. The nearest ranger station was 15 miles away. I could hike it, but that would mean leaving my stuff and being exposed. Still, it was my only option. I filled a small pack with food, water, a map, and a knife. I also took the flashlight. I started walking around noon. About an hour into the hike, I stopped. There was something ahead on the trail. A small pile of rocks, carefully stacked, balanced, like someone had built a marker. I hadn't seen it on my way in. The top rock had a small piece of red cloth tied around it. The wind wasn't blowing, but it fluttered like it was. I felt cold all over. I stepped around it and kept moving. I kept glancing behind me. Couldn't help it. I had the feeling I was being watched. I didn't see anyone, but I knew, absolutely knew, that someone was behind me, just far enough to stay hidden, just close enough to make me feel it. I picked up the pace. My legs burned. My back ached. I kept pushing. About 3 miles from the cabin, I found something that made me stop cold. It was my battery pack, sitting on a rock in the middle of the trail. Right there, clean, with no dirt on it, as if someone had placed it there for me to find. I didn't touch it. I just backed away and kept walking. By late afternoon, the clouds started rolling in. I knew I wouldn't make it to the ranger station before nightfall. I didn't want to be in the open after dark, so I decided to turn off the trail and find somewhere to camp. I found a small overhang in the rocks about 50 yards off the trail and tucked myself in there. I didn't light a fire. I ate a little food, drank some water, and tried to stay warm. I wrapped my jacket around my legs and tried to sleep. That night was the longest of my life. I heard someone walking nearby, slow steps, crunching leaves, then silence, then breathing, not loud but close, right above me. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just sat there, eyes wide, heart pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. I stayed like that until dawn. When the light came, I crept out of the rocks and looked around. Nothing there. No tracks. No signs. But it was the middle of October when I decided to spend a week alone in a remote cabin up in northern Idaho. I had taken some time off work, mostly to clear my head. Things had been piling up mentally for months. I had never really done something like this before. Isolated, no phone signal, no internet. Just me, a wood stove, a few books, and a small journal I brought to write in. The cabin belonged to an old friend of my dad's who rarely used it anymore. It sat on the edge of a wide clearing, surrounded by dense pine forests on all sides. The closest sign of civilization about 18 miles away. A gravel road snaked through the woods and ended just short of the cabin. I got there in the late afternoon, just as the sun started dipping behind the trees. The air was cold, sharp with the early bite of winter, and the ground was soft from a recent rainfall. The cabin was small but solid. It had one bedroom, a little kitchen, and a living area with an old rocking chair and a dusty rug. The smell of old wood and burnt ashes hung in the air. It felt still, too still, like the place had been waiting a long time for someone to come back. The first night was quiet. I lit the wood stove, boiled water for tea, and sat by the window watching the trees. The wind moved gently through the branches, and every so often I could hear small creaks from the wood expanding and contracting. I wrote a little in my journal and crawled into bed early, not used to the silence. It was so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat. By the second day, I settled into a rhythm. I chopped firewood, walked around the perimeter of the cabin, explored a little deeper into the trees, and made simple meals on the old propane stove. I didn't go too far into the woods. The trees were thick and easy to get lost in, but something felt a little off from the beginning. The silence was too complete. I didn't hear birds, didn't see squirrels or rabbits. The forest felt hollow, like it was holding its breath. That evening, I noticed tracks in the dirt near the back of the cabin. They weren't mine. I had only walked in front of the cabin and near the side where the woodpile was. These tracks were larger than boot prints. They were heavy, deep impressions, a little too wide, and not quite the shape you'd expect. I told myself they could have been from a bear or a moose, maybe even days old and deformed by rain. But something about them didn't sit right. I checked the locks on the doors and windows before going to bed that night. The wind had picked up, and the cabin creaked more than before. I had a strange feeling that night as I lay under the covers, like someone was outside. I tried to ignore it, told myself I was being dramatic, that this was part of the experience of being alone in the woods. But I barely slept. On the third day, I found more tracks, this time closer to the front door. They were fresh. The edges were clean. Whatever it was had come by while I slept. I checked the door again. Locked. Windows too. Nothing broken, nothing moved. But I noticed something small. The rocking chair on the porch had shifted. When I got there, it was flush against the wall, tucked under the window. Now it was turned slightly outward, facing the trees. Could have been the wind. Or maybe I just remembered it wrong. I spent most of that day inside. Every time I looked out the window, I thought I saw something move between the trees. Nothing clear, just a shadow or maybe the wind stirring the branches. But it was constant enough that I stopped writing, stopped reading, just sat near the stove, listening. I had no signal, no radio, just the sounds of the woods and my own thoughts. That night, I left the lamp on. I don't know why, maybe just to feel like the darkness wasn't pressing in so close. Around 3 a.m., I heard a noise. Not from inside the cabin, from outside, near the back. It was a thud, not a branch falling, not an animal scurrying. A solid, deliberate thud against the wall. I froze in bed. The sound came again, then a dragging noise, like something moving along the back wall. I didn't move. I barely breathed. After a while, it stopped. In the morning, I went around back. I found new prints, deep, heavy, like before. They led up to the wall, paused, and then continued toward the woods. I noticed long scratch marks on the wall, just above the foundation, for thin lines dragged across the old wood. It wasn't an animal, not unless it was using tools. I looked into the trees, but saw nothing, just silence again. I packed a small bag and hiked toward the gravel road. I thought maybe I could walk to where I last had a signal and call someone. I made it about 6 miles before I realized I had left my only flashlight behind. I didn't want to be caught walking back in the dark, so I turned around. The walk back felt longer. I kept looking over my shoulder. I kept hearing twigs snapping behind me, but every time I stopped, it went quiet. When I got back to the cabin, the front door was open. I know for a fact I locked it. I locked it and double-checked it. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door. I didn't want to go inside, but everything I had was in there. My keys, my food, my gear. Slowly, I stepped in. Nothing looked touched. The stove was cold. The books were still in a pile on the table, but something in the air had changed. It smelled different, like wet earth and something else I couldn't name. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner with my pocket knife, eyes on the door. At one point, I thought I saw something pass by the window, a shape tall and quick. I didn't move. My breathing was shallow. The lamp flickered once and stayed on. The next morning, I decided I had to leave. I couldn't stay another night. I packed everything, shoved it into my backpack, and left. I didn't clean up, didn't write in the journal. I just locked the door and walked. I made it to the road by early afternoon and kept walking until I found a patch of signal and called for a ride. I told the guy who picked me up that I cut the trip short. Didn't give details. I felt embarrassed, like maybe I had just scared myself with the isolation. But the truth is, something was out there, watching, waiting. A few weeks later, I mailed the keys back to the owner with a short thank you note. I never mentioned the tracks or the noises or the door being open. I haven't been back. I don't plan to. I still think about those nights, about the way the woods felt, like they were hiding something, like something there didn't want me around. I kept the journal. Sometimes I read it over, trying to convince myself I imagined most of it. But I always stop at the last thing I wrote, before I packed up. Someone was here. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't supposed to be there. And I think it knew I wasn't supposed to be there either. It started as a short break from the noise of city life. I had been working nonstop for months, long hours, barely sleeping. I felt burnt out. So when a friend told me about a quiet cabin they used once near a remote lake in the northern woods, I decided to take the chance. I packed enough food and gear for a week and drove up north, hoping to get some rest and maybe fish a little. The drive took longer than expected. Paved roads turned to gravel, then gravel turned to dirt, and eventually it was just me and a narrow trail surrounded by tall pine trees. There was no cell signal. My GPS had gone blank an hour ago, but I kept going, trusting the hand-drawn map my friend gave me. I finally found the cabin just before sunset. It was smaller than I thought it would be, just a single room with an old stone fireplace, a narrow bed against the far wall, and a small kitchen set up on one side. There was an outhouse a little ways into the woods and a well with a hand pump nearby. It was basic, but it felt peaceful. I unpacked, lit the oil lamps inside, and cooked some canned stew on the small propane burner I'd brought. That first night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The air was cool, and all I could hear was the soft wind moving through the trees. But by the third day, something started to feel off. It began with small things. I would wake up and find my backpack moved from where I left it. At first, I thought I just forgot I'd moved it. Then I noticed the front door was cracked open one morning, even though I was sure I locked it the night before. I told myself it could have been the wind or maybe the old wooden frame warping, but it kept happening. On the fourth night, I was in bed when I heard footsteps outside. They were light and slow, crunching over the pine needles. I froze. I hadn't seen another person since I got there. I stayed still, barely breathing. The footsteps circled the cabin and stopped by the door. I waited. Nothing. No knock. No sound. Just silence. I didn't sleep that night. As soon as the sky began to lighten, I opened the door. There were no tracks, but the wood's floor was thick with needles and leaves. Footprints wouldn't last long in that. I started to think maybe I imagined it. Sleep deprivation maybe, but I didn't feel tired. I felt alert, too alert. My body was tense in a way it hadn't been before. I spent the next day checking the area. I found nothing. No signs of animals. No boot prints. Nothing that said someone had been near me. Still, I felt watched, like eyes followed me every time I stepped out of the cabin. I started keeping a hatchet with me even inside. That evening, I nailed a few boards across the inside of the door, just in case. I also stacked some furniture in front of it. I laughed at myself for it, but something didn't feel right. That night, just after midnight, I heard movement again. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was like something brushing against the walls of the cabin. I held my breath and waited. A soft thud came from the back wall. Then another, like someone testing the wood. My heart was pounding. I gripped the hatchet and stayed up the entire night, ears tuned to every sound. When daylight came, I went outside with the hatchet in hand. I circled the cabin. Again, nothing. But I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Small pieces of bark had been shaved off the trees around the clearing. Thin, vertical scrapes. Not natural. They looked like they were made with a knife. Not random either. They were placed every few feet, circling the cabin. I took my phone and tried to get a signal. Still nothing. I climbed a nearby hill hoping it might help. When I reached the top, I looked out over the trees. Nothing but endless forest in every direction. I realized then how far I really was from anyone, how isolated. If anything happened, there would be no help coming. That night, I stayed up with all the lamps lit. I kept the hatchet close and a long hunting knife strapped to my side. Around 2 a.m., I heard something again. Not outside this time, inside. A creak came from the far side of the room near the small kitchen. I turned, heart racing, every hair on my body standing up, but there was no one there. I got up and checked the room slowly. Nothing. Then I looked at the window. One of the boards nailed to it was missing. Not broken, removed, neatly, as if someone took it off quietly. I rushed outside with a flashlight and scanned the woods. I moved fast, checking trees and the well. Nothing, but the air felt different, thicker, like something was close. I heard a branch snap to my left and turned quickly, raising the light. Just trees. But I knew something had been there. I ran back inside and didn't sleep again. The next day, I packed my gear. I was done. I didn't care how far the walk was. I needed to leave. I tried to start the truck, but it didn't turn over. The battery was fine, but it just wouldn't start. I opened the hood and found something that made my stomach drop. The wires had been cut. Clean cuts like with a knife. Someone had been under the hood. I went back to the cabin and locked the door again. I started thinking about how long it would take to hike back out. At least a full day, maybe 2. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That if I stepped into the woods, I'd never make it back out. That night, I stayed in a corner of the cabin with both weapons ready. I didn't eat. I barely moved. I just waited. Around midnight, I heard it again. Slow, careful footsteps around the cabin. Then silence. Then a sound like something scratching wood. I held my breath, not daring to move. Suddenly, a loud slam hit the back wall. Then another. Then the side wall. It was like they were trying to shake the place apart. I didn't yell. I didn't run. I just waited, frozen, until it stopped. When the sun rose, I didn't even check. I left everything but my bag and weapons. I took my compass and started walking straight south. I didn't follow any trails. I just moved. Fast. I didn't stop until nightfall. I didn't sleep. I kept walking until I found a forest ranger outpost the next day. I told them my truck broke down. They drove me back to the highway. I didn't mention the rest. I didn't want them thinking I was crazy. When I got back home, I checked the news. There were no reports of missing people, no strange stories from the area. But I found something else. A small forum post from a hunter who had been in those same woods the year before. He wrote about feeling watched, about things moving in the night, about finding strange marks on trees. The post ended with him saying he left early and never went back. I've never gone back either. I don't know who or what was out there, but it wasn't an animal. It wasn't random. Someone was living in those woods, far from anyone, and they didn't want visitors. I still have the hatchet. I still wake up some nights thinking I hear something scratching at the wall, but I'm not going back, ever. It was late September when I decided to take a week off and head into the woods. I needed a break from the city, the crowds, the deadlines, and the constant noise. I found a small cabin for rent online. It was far out, about 3 hours away from the nearest town, down a dirt road that barely qualified as a road. The pictures showed a weathered wooden cabin, surrounded by thick trees and a shallow creek nearby. It looked peaceful, just what I needed. The listing said it had solar power, a well for water, and a wood-burning stove. No Wi-Fi, no cell service. That was the point. I packed enough food for a week. Canned stuff mostly, bags of rice, oatmeal, peanut butter, and some freeze-dried meals. I brought a few books, a notepad, and some tools just in case. I also packed my knife, a flashlight, extra batteries, and a basic first aid kit. I wasn't new to this kind of thing. I camped a lot growing up, even done some solo backpacking in my 20s. But I'd never spent a full week completely alone in the woods. I arrived at the cabin just before sunset on a Sunday. The drive-in was rough. The dirt road twisted and turned, and at times it felt like I was going to bottom out my car. There were fallen branches, deep ruts, and a section where I had to drive through a shallow creek. But I made it. The cabin looked just like the pictures, old but solid. The porch had a single rocking chair. The windows were small. The roof was made of rusted tin. Inside, it smelled like old wood and dust. There was a small bed, a table, 2 chairs, some shelves with dishes, and the wood stove in the corner. Everything was simple. I unpacked, lit a few candles, and got a small fire going in the stove. The warmth was comforting. That first night, I slept like a rock. Total silence. No cars, no sirens, no neighbors yelling. Just the sound of wind through the trees and the occasional creak of the old cabin settling. The first 2 days were peaceful. I hiked around the area, followed the creek for a while, and sat on the porch reading. I didn't see anyone. No other cabins, no hikers. Just animals, squirrels, a deer, a few birds. I was relaxed. I felt like I could finally breathe. On the 3rd day, something felt off. I woke up around 3 a.m. for no reason. The cabin was quiet, but I had a strange feeling. It wasn't fear exactly, more like my brain had picked up something it couldn't quite process. I got up, checked the door. It was still locked. I looked out the window but couldn't see anything. I went back to bed. The next morning, I noticed something strange. A piece of firewood I had stacked near the door was missing. I thought maybe I had moved it and forgot. Later that day, while walking near the creek, I saw a footprint in the mud. Not a boot print, barefoot, adult-sized. The toes were clear. I froze. It wasn't mine. I'd been wearing boots the whole time. I looked around but didn't see anyone. I told myself it was probably old. Maybe someone had come through before me, but it bothered me. That night, I pushed the small table in front of the door before going to bed. It didn't make me feel much better, but I did it anyway. I slept lightly, waking up at every noise. Just after midnight, I heard something move outside. A soft crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. Then another. It stopped near the porch. I held my breath. I didn't move. My heart pounded in my ears. I waited. No more sounds. I don't know how long I stayed awake, but it was a long time. In the morning, I stepped outside slowly. The air was cold and damp. I looked around the cabin. I didn't see anything at first. Then I noticed it. A long, shallow scratch on the wall near the window. Fresh. The wood was lighter where the surface had been scraped. It wasn't deep, but it was long, maybe 2 feet. I couldn't explain it. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a bear. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Bears don't leave thin, straight scratches like that. I decided to explore the area more. I walked in a wide circle around the cabin, checking for signs, footprints, broken branches, anything. About 50 yards into the trees, I found something. A small pile of stones, neatly stacked, like a tiny cairn, maybe a foot tall. That wasn't natural. Someone had made it. The stones were round and smooth, likely from the creek. They'd been placed carefully, balanced on top of one another. It wasn't far from where I found the footprint. I knocked it over with my boot. Felt wrong, like I was breaking some rule I didn't know about. That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire going and stayed up most of the time, listening. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something. A shuffle, a branch snap, something distant. Around 2 a.m., I heard tapping. Not loud, just soft, rhythmic tapping on the side of the cabin, like someone drumming fingers against the wall. I sat up in bed, frozen. It lasted maybe a minute, then stopped. I didn't go outside. In the morning, I found another scratch. Same spot, just below the first one. I checked the woods again. No footprints this time, but the stone pile was back. Same height, same kind of rocks. I hadn't brought it back. Someone had, or something. I spent that day gathering wood and making sure everything inside the cabin was secure. I double-checked the windows, propped the table against the door again, and kept my knife nearby. I was tired, but I didn't want to leave early. I wanted to stick it out. I wanted to believe it was all in my head. The 5th night was worse. I didn't sleep at all. I heard movement constantly. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move past the window. I didn't have the nerve to check. I stayed in bed, knife in hand, staring at the ceiling. I kept the fire going, not because I was cold, but because I didn't want the darkness to get too close. When the sun came up, I decided to leave. I was done. I packed everything fast and loaded the car. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't even put the fire out. I just wanted to be gone. Driving out was slow. The road was rougher than I remembered. Halfway through the forest road, I saw something in the trees. Person, barefoot, standing behind a tree half hidden. They didn't move, just watched. I didn't stop. When I got home, I didn't talk about it. I didn't write a review of the cabin. I didn't call the owner. I couldn't explain what happened without sounding crazy. There was no proof, no photos, no injuries, just scratches, footprints, and a pile of stones. But I know what I felt, and I know I was being watched. That week changed how I think about being alone in the woods. I used to find peace in silence, in the trees and wind. But now silence feels like a trap, like something is waiting, watching. I haven't been camping since. I still love nature, but I won't sleep alone in a cabin ever again. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear that soft tapping sound. Not outside, inside my head, like a warning I can't forget. I hadn't planned on being in that cabin more than 2 nights. It was supposed to be a quick break. Just me, a little quiet, and a place where cell signals couldn't reach. I rented the cabin through a site that looked like it hadn't been updated since the early 2000s. The photos were grainy, but the price was cheap, and it was tucked into the mountains about 3 hours from where I lived. I didn't think too much about it. I packed up my car, just some basic food, a couple of changes of clothes, a sleeping bag, and a cooler full of drinks, and hit the road. The drive was peaceful. It started off on the highway, then turned into winding country roads that slowly got narrower. Trees started growing thicker along the sides. The last hour was all gravel roads and no signs of other houses. By the time I arrived, it was late afternoon. The sky had that yellowish light it gets before sunset. I saw the cabin tucked between tall pines, sitting on a slight hill with a clearing around it. The place looked exactly like the pictures, run down but still standing. The wooden boards were faded gray, some warped. The windows were dirty. One had a crack across it. But the door worked, and the lights came on when I flipped the switch, so I figured it was fine. Inside, it was small. One main room with a bed in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, a small kitchenette with a rusted sink, and a bathroom barely big enough for a toilet and shower. It smelled like dust and something sour, maybe old wood or dead insects in the walls. But it wasn't terrible. I dropped my stuff, cracked open a can of beer, and sat on the front step. It was quiet, that kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. No cars, no people, just the sound of wind pushing through the trees. That first night, I made pasta on the portable stove, ate while looking at my phone's blank screen, then went to bed early. I had trouble sleeping. The bed creaked every time I moved. I kept waking up to little noises, something tapping on the window once, a rustling sound outside, maybe a raccoon or a fox. The cabin didn't have curtains, so every time I opened my eyes, I saw the black shape of the trees outside the glass. Around 3 in the morning, I heard a weird thud from the back wall. Not loud, just enough to make my chest tighten. I stayed frozen in the bed, staring at the dark ceiling, until I finally drifted off again. In the morning, I checked around the cabin. Nothing seemed disturbed. No footprints. Nothing broken. I brushed it off. Spent the day hiking a trail I found nearby. The trail wasn't well maintained. Parts were covered in overgrowth, and some of the signs were missing or bent. I had to double back a couple of times, but I still enjoyed the peace of it. When I got back, I made eggs and toast, read an old book I brought, and planned to head home the next morning. That second night, though, that's when things got weird. It started with the sound of a vehicle. Around midnight, I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard tires crunching gravel. I sat up. The cabin was so remote that the sound of another car nearby didn't make sense. I hadn't seen a neighbor for miles. I walked to the window and looked out, but I didn't see anything. The gravel path dipped downhill from the front of the cabin, curving out of sight. Whatever made that sound had either stopped behind the trees or turned off the road. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to decide if I should be worried. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe a ranger or someone who got lost. Still, I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, turned off the lights, and got back into bed. About 20 minutes later, I heard footsteps. They were slow, crunching leaves, coming from the woods behind the cabin. I lay perfectly still, my heart pounding. The footsteps got closer. Then they stopped. I didn't know if whoever it was standing behind the cabin or beside it, but I didn't hear them walk away. I sat up and waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. I finally got up and crept to the window. The moon was bright enough that I could see parts of the clearing, but the shadows near the edge of the woods were thick. I stared for a long time but didn't see anything. I thought maybe I imagined the whole thing. When I woke up, the sun was already high. I hadn't realized I fell asleep again. I stepped outside to clear my head, and that's when I saw the footprints. They were behind the cabin, right below the small window of the bathroom. The grass was flattened and muddy, and I could see clear shoe prints, deep ones like someone stood there for a while. They led out into the woods, not toward the road. I felt sick. I took a photo of the prints, even though there was no signal to send it to anyone. I thought about leaving right then, but I told myself maybe it was just a hiker. Still, I packed my bag quickly, loaded the car, and was about to get in when I realized my keys weren't in my pocket. I checked the cabin. Not on the table, not in the kitchen, not in the bed. I tore the place apart. Nothing. I looked outside, in the grass near the steps. Still nothing. I started to panic. Without the keys, I couldn't leave. I had no phone signal to call anyone. I thought maybe I dropped them on the hike, but I was sure I had them when I got back the day before. I sat in the car for an hour, sweating, just thinking, trying to remember every little movement I made since getting back. Then, I decided to break one of the cabin's windows and stay inside with a kitchen knife in hand. Felt stupid, but it was all I could do. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner of the room with my back against the wall, facing the front door. The lights were off. I kept the flashlight next to me. Hours passed. The woods stayed quiet. Then, around 3:30 a.m., I heard the back door handle rattle. I nearly dropped the knife. Someone was trying the door. I held my breath. After a few seconds, it stopped. I waited. Nothing. Then the front doorknob rattled too. Not hard, just enough to test it. I clicked the flashlight on and pointed it at the door. I didn't see anything through the peephole. I stood there for a long time, light shaking in my hand. Then I heard the sound of something brushing against the wall outside. Not footsteps, just a soft scrape. Then silence. I didn't hear anything else the rest of the night. When the sun rose, I stepped outside with the knife, scanning everything. The prints from the day before were gone. The ground looked undisturbed. I walked the perimeter of the cabin. Then I went around again. On the third lap, I found my keys. They were sitting on the stump near the tree lean, facing the cabin. Perfectly placed. Not dropped. Placed. I stared at them for a long time. I didn't want to touch them, but I had no choice. I grabbed them, ran to the car, and left. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. I never reported anything. Never went back. I still think about it, though. Who it was. Why they watched me. Why they didn't do more. I keep that photo of the footprints on my desktop. A reminder. Next time I want a quiet weekend away, I'll just stay home. It was mid-September when I decided to take a break from the noise of the city. I had been working non-stop for months, barely getting enough sleep. The constant emails, the endless meetings, the pressure to always be available had started to mess with my head. I needed silence, and not just the kind you get with earplugs. I needed nature, fresh air, and time alone. So I booked a small off-grid cabin deep in the mountains of Montana, far from cell service, people, and everything else. The cabin was about a 5-hour drive from the nearest town. The last part of the drive was a narrow dirt road that twisted up a thickly wooded mountainside. There were no houses, no stores, no gas stations, just forest that stretched as far as the eye could see. I brought everything I needed with me. Canned food, a large water container, a sleeping bag, and some basic tools. The cabin was advertised as primitive. It had no electricity, no plumbing, just a wood stove, an outhouse, and a rainwater barrel. That was exactly what I wanted. When I finally got there, it was late afternoon. The air was cool, and the leaves were just beginning to change color. The cabin was even more remote than I imagined. It stood alone in a small clearing, surrounded by thick pine trees. The only sound was the wind through the branches. I unpacked quickly, bringing my supplies inside, then walked around to get a sense of the area. There was a narrow trail leading downhill to a small creek, and a faint path that looked like it hadn't been used in a long time winding into the woods on the other side. I made a mental note not to wander too far. That first night was quiet. I lit a few candles, made some soup on the wood stove, and read until I was too tired to keep my eyes open. I slept well, better than I had in months. The next few days were peaceful. I spent my mornings hiking short trails, my afternoons reading or writing in my journal, and my evenings by the fire. The quiet was almost overwhelming at first, like I had forgotten what real silence felt like. There were no voices, no buzzing phones, not even the hum of appliances. Just the wind, the crackling fire, and sometimes the sound of animals moving in the trees. But on the fourth night, something changed. I had just gone to bed when I heard something outside. It was faint, almost too faint to notice, but it sounded like slow, deliberate footsteps on dry leaves. I sat up and held my breath, listening. For a while, I heard nothing. Then again, another soft crunch. Then nothing. I tried to tell myself it was a deer or a raccoon. I knew animals moved around at night, but these steps had a rhythm, a certain weight to them, like a person walking carefully. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, looking for footprints. The ground was covered with leaves, and it was hard to tell, but near the back corner of the cabin, I thought I saw a patch where the leaves looked disturbed, like someone had stepped and shifted their weight. I stood there for a while, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The rest of the day was normal. I chopped some wood, refilled my water jug from the creek, and made another simple meal. But I couldn't stop thinking about the sound I heard. That night, I didn't light any candles. I sat in the dark with the fire low, listening. Around midnight, I heard it again. Crunch, pause, crunch. This time, the steps came closer. I didn't move. I stayed in bed, holding my breath, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It circled the cabin once. I could hear it moving just beyond the walls. Then it stopped near the door. For a long time, nothing. I finally fell asleep just before dawn. When I woke up, I decided I needed to do something. I wasn't ready to leave, but I needed to feel safer. I looked through my supplies and found a small hatchet I had brought for splitting kindling. I kept it with me at all times after that. That day, I also blocked the windows with blankets and boards I found in the shed behind the cabin. I wanted to make it harder for anyone to see inside. I checked the lock on the door. It was basic, just a latch and a wooden bar. I added another bar across the inside using some extra wood and nails. That night, I sat in the dark again, hatchet in hand, waiting. And again, around midnight, the steps came. They were slower this time, more deliberate. They came all the way to the front of the cabin. I heard something brush against the door. I didn't breathe. Then I heard it again. Something rubbing against the wood, then a soft knock. Just one. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear. I sat there, frozen. After a few minutes, the sound went away. But I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I packed my bag. I told myself I'd had enough. I didn't care how much time I had left in the rental. I couldn't take another night like that. But when I went to start my car, it wouldn't turn over. I tried again and again, but the engine just clicked. The battery was dead. I opened the hood and checked everything I could, but I didn't know much about cars. It looked fine, no chewed wires, nothing obviously wrong. Just dead. I didn't know what to do. The nearest town was more than 30 miles away. I didn't have any cell service. I thought about trying to walk it, but the idea of being in the woods at night without shelter didn't sit right with me. I decided I'd stay one more night and leave at first light, walking the road until I reached someone. That evening, I kept a small fire going outside. I didn't want to be inside the cabin. I sat near the flames with my hatchet, listening. The fire made me feel safer, but it also made me visible. I kept it small and put it out before midnight, then went back inside. I stayed awake as long as I could, but sometime after 1, I must have dozed off. I woke up to a sound I hadn't heard before. It wasn't footsteps. It was the sound of wood cracking, like pressure being applied slowly. I sat up and listened. It was coming from the back of the cabin. I grabbed the hatchet and crept to the back wall. I pressed my ear to the wood. I could hear breathing. Slow, steady, quiet. Then the cracking came again, louder this time. Something was pushing against the wall, trying to pry one of the boards loose. I ran to the front, opened the door, and stepped outside. I had no plan. I just didn't want to be inside if the wall gave way. I stood in the clearing, waiting. The moon was out, casting pale light over the trees. I didn't see anything, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Then I heard it. A twig snapped near the trees. I turned and stared into the darkness. Nothing. Another crack, this time closer. I backed toward the cabin but didn't go in. I circled to the side, trying to see the back wall. I still didn't see anyone. No shapes, no movement, just trees. But I could hear it, breathing, and then I saw it. Just for a second. Person, or maybe just the shape of one, standing at the edge of the clearing. I couldn't see their face. They didn't move. I didn't either. We stood there for what felt like an hour, but it was probably only a few minutes. Then they turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I sat on the porch, hatchet in hand, until the sun came up. When it was light enough to see clearly, I gathered my bag, took some food, and started walking. I followed the dirt road down the mountain. I walked for hours, looking over my shoulder every few minutes. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement in the woods, but it was always too quick, too far. I didn't stop. Late in the afternoon, a truck came around the bend. I ran into the middle of the road waving my arms. The driver stopped, and I climbed into the bed without a word. He took me into town. I didn't explain much, just said my car broke down and I needed to call for help. He didn't ask questions. Later, when I got back with a tow truck, my car started on the first try. The mechanic looked at me like I was crazy. There was nothing wrong with the battery. I didn't go back to the cabin. I left everything there. I didn't even get my deposit back. I didn't care. A few weeks later, I looked up the area. There had been a few incidents over the years. Reports of strange people living off-grid, people going missing, campers hearing footsteps, things like that. Nothing confirmed. No arrests, just stories. I still think about it sometimes. I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed one more night. If the wall had broken. If I had opened the door when I heard that knock. Now, whenever I hear the wind through the trees or the soft crunch of leaves, my body tenses up. I know it was real, and I know I was lucky to get out when I did. It was late September when I decided to take a break from the noise of the city and spend a week alone in a remote cabin up in northern Maine. I had been feeling overwhelmed for months. Long hours at work, my phone constantly buzzing with emails, traffic, noise, and people. I craved silence, space, and time alone. A coworker had once told me about a small, off-grid cabin he rented a few years ago near Moosehead Lake. It was isolated, surrounded by thick woods, no electricity, no cell signal, and barely any road access. That sounded perfect. The drive there took nearly 12 hours, and the last hour was spent navigating a narrow dirt road filled with potholes, fallen branches, and thick mud. The further I went, the more I questioned my decision, but I kept pushing forward. Just when I was starting to think I had made a mistake, the trees opened up, and I saw the cabin sitting on a small clearing. It was modest, built from old wood that had turned gray over the years, with a rusted tin roof and a wraparound porch. A small creek ran about 50 yards from it, and the air was thick with the smell of pine and damp soil. The first day was peaceful. I unpacked my food supplies, set up the little wood-burning stove, checked the outhouse, and lit a fire in the stone pit outside. I read a book until the sun went down and then sat quietly on the porch wrapped in a blanket, listening to the crickets and the wind through the trees. Felt good. Too good, maybe. The second day started with cold, crisp air and the sound of birds. I took a short hike through the woods, marked the trail with red ribbons so I wouldn't get lost, and spent a good chunk of time near the creek with my feet in the water. I cooked a simple meal on the fire and started another book. That night, I noticed something odd. While I was sitting by the fire pit, just as the sun was going down, I thought I saw something move between the trees across the clearing. I stared at the spot for a long time, but whatever I thought I saw didn't move again. I figured it was a deer or maybe a moose. Still, it unsettled me just enough to make me go inside earlier than I planned. By the third day, I noticed signs that someone might have been nearby. One of the red trail ribbons I had tied was missing. Another one was moved, tied to a different tree. I was sure of it. I retraced my steps multiple times, thinking maybe I had been careless, but I wasn't. I was always careful with navigation. That evening, I felt like I was being watched. I couldn't see anything through the trees, but it was just a feeling that dug its way into my gut. I locked the cabin door, something I hadn't bothered to do the previous nights, and kept the fire going until late. I hardly slept. The next morning, I found footprints. Human ones. They weren't mine. I checked by the creek and saw at least 4 or 5 clear impressions in the mud. Bigger than my feet. Deeper. They came from the woods and stopped near the edge of the clearing. They didn't go back. It was like someone had walked up to the cabin and just stood there. I spent that day on edge, walking circles around the cabin, listening for twigs snapping or leaves rustling. I didn't go hiking again. I didn't even go to the creek. I kept the hatchet nearby just in case. When night came, I barely turned off the lantern. I sat with my back against the wall, facing the door, and waited. Nothing happened. On the 5th day, I discovered something that made my stomach twist. Behind the cabin, maybe 30 feet into the woods, I found a small circle of stones. In the center was a pile of broken branches shaped like a crude symbol, almost like a stick figure with no arms. It looked intentional. Someone had built it. I kicked it apart, picked up the stones, and threw them back into the woods. I didn't care if I was overreacting. I didn't like it. That afternoon, I heard what sounded like a whistle in the trees. 2 short, high-pitched notes, coming from the direction of the trail. Then silence. I froze and stood still for several minutes, trying to convince myself it was just a bird. But no bird I ever heard made a sound like that. When I finally went back inside, I locked everything again and moved a dresser in front of the door. That night, I woke up to the sound of someone walking on the porch. Slow, heavy steps. The boards creaked under their weight. I held my breath and listened. They walked across the porch once, then again, slower the second time. I grabbed the hatchet and sat in the corner, every muscle in my body tensed. Then the footsteps stopped. Hours passed. I must have dozed off with the hatchet still in my hands. When the sun came up, I rushed out and checked the porch. No footprints, no marks, nothing out of place. But that didn't matter. I knew what I heard. On the 6th day, I made a decision. I was leaving. I packed my bags, loaded the car, and walked one last time around the cabin. When I got to the back, I saw something carved into the tree right outside the window. Deep cuts. A tall figure with 2 long legs and a featureless oval head. Below it, more symbols like the one I had destroyed. My stomach dropped. Someone had been that close while I was inside. I got in my car and drove. I didn't care about the potholes or the fallen branches. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest gas station an hour and a half later. I told the clerk there what happened, and he just stared at me, then shrugged, said the woods up there were strange sometimes. I didn't push the conversation. When I got home, I couldn't sleep for days. Every sound made me jump. I kept checking the locks, kept the lights on, stayed away from windows. I told a few close friends about what happened, but nobody really knew what to say. Maybe I'll never know who or what was out there. Maybe it was some local messing with me. Maybe it was someone who lived in those woods. Maybe it was worse. All I know is, I'm never going back to that cabin again. I wanted peace and quiet. What I got was something else entirely. something that made me feel like I didn't belong out there, like I was being warned. I took the warning seriously. Now, whenever I think about getting away from the city again, I remember those footsteps on the porch, that whistling sound, and that carved figure outside my window, and I stay home. It was the middle of October when I took a break from everything. I had been stuck in a loop between work and home for months, and I was getting burned out. I wanted to disconnect from the noise, the traffic, the internet, even people. So, I found this small cabin listed online that was about a 5-hour drive from where I lived. The pictures showed an old wooden structure surrounded by nothing but forest and a small lake behind it. No cell signal, no Wi-Fi, no neighbors. It looked perfect. I packed enough food for a week, filled my gas tank, and left before sunrise on a Monday. The roads were empty at first, but as I got deeper into the woods, they turned into narrow gravel paths. The last hour was the roughest part. My car shook over uneven ground, and tree branches scratched the sides. Finally, I saw the cabin, sitting like a forgotten piece of the past. It looked even more isolated than I had imagined. It was small but solid. 1 bedroom, a bathroom, a kitchen, and a living room with a fireplace. The windows were dusty but intact. There was a generator out back and a woodpile stacked against the side. Inside, it smelled like old pine and damp earth. Everything was worn but clean. Whoever owned it had left it stocked with some dry food, candles, and firewood. I brought my own supplies anyway. The first 2 days were quiet. I spent my time hiking through the woods, reading, making simple meals, and sitting on the porch watching the trees move in the wind. I didn't even bring my laptop. I felt a kind of calm that I hadn't felt in years. At night, I used candles or the fireplace for light. The silence was so thick that even the smallest noise stood out. A cracking branch, the wind pushing through the trees, an owl far off. I liked it, but on the 3rd night, something changed. I had gone to bed around 10 p.m. after reading by the fire. I woke up sometime later to a sound. At first, I couldn't tell what it was. It wasn't loud, but it was strange. I lay still and listened. It sounded like crunching, like boots slowly pressing into dry leaves or gravel. I thought maybe it was an animal, maybe a deer, but it kept going. Slow, steady, and close. I sat up and looked out the window near the bed. It was too dark to see anything. I hadn't left any lights on outside. The crunching stopped. I waited a few minutes, then slowly got up and walked to the front door. I opened it just enough to peek out. Nothing. Just darkness and the faint outline of the trees. I listened again, dead quiet. I closed the door, locked it, and stood there for a while. I wasn't sure what I had heard. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was letting the isolation get to my head. I went back to bed and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I went outside to look around. The ground was covered in leaves, but I didn't see any clear footprints. Still, I walked a circle around the cabin. Nothing seemed out of place. I told myself it had probably been a raccoon or something, maybe even a branch falling. That day, I stayed closer to the cabin. I spent the morning chopping wood and the afternoon sitting on the porch. The feeling I had the night before kept coming back though, like something was off. When the sun started going down, I locked the door early. I ate a quick meal and lit the fireplace again. Around midnight, I woke up a second time. This time, I didn't hear anything at first. I just felt something, like something was near. I got up and walked quietly to the window. I looked out and thought I saw a shape near the trees, just standing there, not moving. My eyes weren't used to the dark, and I couldn't be sure, but it looked like a person. I turned away and grabbed the flashlight. When I shone it out the window, the shape was gone. I stood there, heart pounding, waiting for movement. Nothing. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, sitting by the fireplace with the flashlight in my lap. The next day, I considered leaving early, but I didn't want to overreact. Maybe I had imagined it. I didn't see any signs of someone being there. No footprints, no broken branches. I stayed one more night. That night, I didn't go to bed. I stayed awake by the window with the flashlight and a kitchen knife. I know it sounds dumb now, but that's what I had. Around 2 a.m., I heard the crunching again. Slow, steady. I turned off the flashlight and crouched near the window. I could just barely make out a figure. This time I knew it wasn't my imagination. Someone was standing about 30 feet from the cabin. Not moving, not making any sound. I waited. My heart was thudding so hard I thought it would give me away. After a long time, the figure moved. It walked slowly toward the back of the cabin. I moved to the other window but couldn't see anything. I stayed there until the sky started turning gray. As soon as it was light, I went outside and checked. I finally found something. Footprints. Human ones. They came from the woods, circled the cabin, and went back into the trees. I followed them for about 50 yards before they disappeared into thicker brush. That was enough. I went back in, packed everything, and left an hour later. I didn't even eat breakfast. I drove back through those rough roads faster than I should have. The whole time I kept looking in the mirror. When I got home, I checked the listing again. It had been taken down. I called the number I used to book the cabin, and it was out of service. I searched for the cabin online using images and maps. Nothing. I couldn't even find the exact spot again. It was like the whole place just vanished. A few weeks later, I went to a local outdoor store to get some new gear. I started talking to the guy behind the counter, and I told him a little about the trip. He said there were old properties like that deep in the woods, some that used to belong to logging companies or hunting clubs. Most were abandoned now, and not all of them were on maps. He said some people still squat in them. I didn't ask anything else. I didn't want to know. It's been months since then, and I haven't gone on another trip like that. I still think about that figure standing outside the cabin. No sounds, no movement, just watching. I still don't know what they wanted, or how long they had been out there before I saw them. I wonder if they had been watching me the whole time. I tell myself I got lucky, that I left in time. I remind myself there were no broken windows, no forced doors, no violence, but it doesn't make me feel any better. I don't think I'll ever go back to the woods alone again. I never used to be the kind of person who got scared of being alone. I actually liked the quiet. I liked working with my hands, being away from people, being deep in the woods where the only sound was wind through the trees and the occasional crack of a branch under a deer's hooves. That's why I didn't hesitate when I got the job offer to help restore an old hunting cabin way out in the remote part of a national forest in Montana. The pay was decent, the timeline was short, just 4 weeks, and I'd have complete privacy. I thought it would be peaceful. I drove out there in mid-September, right before the first signs of early snow. The air was cool and dry. My truck was packed with tools, non-perishable food, a backup generator, and everything else I'd need. I'd already been told there'd be no cell service, and the nearest ranger station was a 2-hour drive. But that didn't bother me. I'd camped and worked in more isolated places before. I figured I'd get the job done, maybe even finish early, and enjoy the time away. The cabin sat at the edge of a frozen lake. No other buildings were nearby. It was old but still solid. The owner, who I'd never met in person, just gave me the keys and a checklist. Fix the roof, replace the flooring in the main room, clean up the shed out back, and do some plumbing and wiring work inside. Basic stuff for someone with my experience. He'd already wired some funds into my account, with the rest due when I finished. The rules were simple. Don't break anything I didn't need to touch, don't leave early, and don't bring guests. I got there on a Tuesday late afternoon. The dirt road to the cabin had been rough, but I made it with no issues. I checked the place out before unpacking. It was dusty and smelled like dry wood and something a little sour, maybe from the plumbing. The windows were dirty but unbroken. The furniture was old but usable. There were no signs of mice or mold, which was a good start. The first few days went smoothly. I worked from sunrise to sundown, starting with the flooring. I'd pull up rotted planks, clear out debris, and nail in fresh wood. The quiet made the work feel meditative. At night, I'd make a fire in the old stone fireplace, eat from cans, read, and go to bed early. No sounds except the wind and the occasional creaking from the old wood beams. By the 5th day, I noticed something odd, not scary, just off. My trail camera, which I set up to monitor the shed in case of animals, had stopped recording. It was one of those motion-triggered models with night vision. I checked the batteries, but they were fine. The memory card was blank from the last 48 hours. I figured I'd just messed up the settings, reset it, and forgot about it. On day 7, I found the shed door open in the morning. I always shut it at night. It wasn't locked, just latched. But the wind wasn't strong enough to open it, and there were no signs of animal prints in the dirt. A few tools had fallen over, but nothing was missing. I assumed I hadn't shut it right. Then, the following night, I was woken up by a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't wind or a tree creaking. It was sharper. It was around 2 in the morning. I sat up, still half asleep, and listened. It was like something brushing against the side of the cabin. Not claws, not scraping. More like someone lightly dragging a stick along the wood. It only lasted a few seconds. Then it was gone. The next morning, I went outside and walked around the cabin. I found marks in the dirt, small, spaced out prints. They weren't boots or paws. They looked like bare feet. Not animal, not child, adult. And they led off into the woods, toward the trees. The air was still cold enough at night that walking barefoot would have been painful. I looked around for a while, thinking maybe it was a prank or I'd stepped in the dirt the day before and just didn't remember. But I hadn't walked barefoot once since I got there. On day 10, things got worse. I went to work on the roof in the early afternoon. I'd finished pulling off some old shingles and was starting to hammer in new ones when I looked down and saw someone standing at the edge of the woods. They weren't moving, just standing there maybe 40 feet away. It was a man, tall, thin, dressed in old clothes, maybe hunting gear. But what froze me wasn't what he was wearing. It was that he didn't move, didn't shift, didn't wave, just stared at the cabin. And me, I stared back for a good 10 seconds. Then I blinked, and he was gone. Just like that. No sound, no rustling, nothing. It was broad daylight. I climbed down and checked the tree line. I didn't find footprints, no broken branches, nothing. Just empty space where he had been. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside felt louder. I kept the fire going and had my flashlight within reach. I heard something again, closer this time, like someone stepping on old boards near the porch. I didn't open the door. I didn't even move. I just sat in the chair, holding the flashlight and a hatchet from my tool bag. The next morning, I found one of my trail cameras on the ground. It had been smashed. The casing was cracked, and the lens shattered. Not by an animal. It had been taken off the tree and slammed into something hard. My other camera, one I'd set to face the lake, was missing entirely. Just gone. The strap that held it was torn. That was the first time I considered leaving. I loaded up some gear, filled the tank in my truck, and even turned the key in the ignition. But the engine didn't turn over. I checked everything. Battery was fine. Fuel pump made its usual hum. But it wouldn't start. I opened the hood and found wires cut. Clean cut. Not chewed. Not corroded. Someone had taken a blade to the wiring harness. I was stuck. I had a backup generator and enough food, but no cell signal. I couldn't call anyone. I considered walking to the ranger station, but it would take a full day each way, and the weather had started to shift. Clouds were moving in. I thought maybe I'd stay a couple more days, try to fix the wiring, and hike out if things got worse. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up to sounds. Soft footsteps outside, the creak of the front steps, a light tapping on the window glass. I didn't get out of bed. I just lay there, not even breathing loud, gripping my flashlight and listening to the silence between noises. The next morning, I found footprints again. This time, they circled the cabin. They were spaced evenly, deliberate. They stopped at every window. I found marks on the door, tiny scratches, like someone had dragged a key across it slowly. The shed door was open again. Inside, one of my hammers was gone. I carried a hunting rifle, which I'd brought more for bear safety than anything else. I cleaned it, loaded it, and started keeping it nearby. I didn't like guns much, but I felt better just having it close. Over the next 2 days, I barely worked. I tried to fix the truck wiring, but it was too damaged. I couldn't do it without replacement parts. I I couldn't stop thinking about the man I saw, the bare footprints, the missing camera, the idea that someone was out there watching me, maybe even walking right up to the cabin at night. I checked the forest edge constantly. I never saw anyone again, but I felt it. I felt watched. The final straw came 3 nights later. I was lying in bed when I heard something move inside the cabin. Inside, not outside. It was soft at first, just a shuffle of feet. I froze. My heart was beating so loud I could hear it in my ears. I waited. I reached slowly for the rifle next to me and sat up, holding my breath. Then I heard it again. A slow step, the sound of wood creaking under weight. It was coming from the kitchen area just outside the bedroom door. I sat perfectly still, pointing the rifle at the door. I didn't move for hours. I waited until the light started coming through the windows. When I finally got up, I found nothing, no one, but the back door was wide open. And on the table was my hammer, the one missing from the shed. I left that day. I packed everything I could carry, locked the cabin, and started walking. I didn't care about the truck. I didn't care about the money. I walked for 10 hours, straight through the forest, along the dirt road until I found another person, a hiker with a satellite phone. I called for help, reported everything to the Forest Service. They never found anyone. The cabin was checked. The door had no signs of forced entry. The camera, they said, could have been taken by a bear. The wiring might have been chewed, they said. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. Someone was out there, watching, waiting, not trying to kill me, not trying to scare me off fast, just waiting for something, for me to leave or maybe for me to stay too long. I never went back. I moved on, took smaller jobs, stayed close to towns. Every time I go into the woods now, I carry 2 phones, a flare, and I tell people exactly where I'm going and when I'll be back. And I never sleep near a window, not anymore. I don't like the woods much, never really did. I grew up in a small city and liked things where I could see them. Buildings, lights, people walking dogs, traffic, noise and motion. Something about the stillness in the woods always made me feel like I wasn't alone, even when I knew I was. But my cousin Ryan had this old family cabin tucked deep into the backcountry of Idaho. I hadn't seen him in a couple years, and he'd been nagging me to visit since he finished fixing it up. I kept brushing it off, always giving him excuses: work, weather, life. Finally, in early October last year, I gave in. I needed a break from everything. Work had been a mess, my sleep schedule was trash, and I figured some time away from the noise would be good for me. Ryan wasn't going to be there, though. He was flying to Oregon for a job interview the week I chose to come up. So he gave me directions and told me where he'd hidden the spare key. I figured it'd be a couple of quiet days to myself. No cell reception, no internet, no stress. The drive out was long. Once I passed through the last small town, a place called Elkview, it was another 45 minutes on unmarked roads. I had to keep the directions in my lap. No GPS signal. The path eventually turned to dirt and gravel, winding upward into dense forest, then narrowed into what barely looked like a road at all. I followed his instructions and found the cabin tucked at the edge of a clearing. Trees surrounded it on all sides except the front, where the land dipped into a small slope and opened up to a lake about 200 feet away. The trees went right up to the edge of the water on the other side. The cabin looked solid. He'd done a good job fixing it up. The outside was all dark wood, and there was a porch with 2 old chairs. One of them rocked slightly in the breeze as I pulled up. I parked near a tree stump and grabbed my duffel bag and cooler from the back seat. The air was sharp and cool, not freezing, but colder than I'd expected for early October. I found the key behind a loose board near the porch, just like Ryan had said. I pushed the door open, and the smell of cedar and dust hit me. The inside was clean and basic. A small kitchen with an old gas stove, a dining table with 2 chairs, a couch, and a wood stove near the far wall. The back had a hallway with a tiny bathroom and 1 bedroom. He'd stocked the place with firewood and canned food. I didn't bring much myself, just some snacks, a couple frozen meals, and water. There was a hand pump out back for lake water if I needed more, and an outhouse just past the tree line in case the bathroom stopped working. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked a little, walked down to the lake, and skipped stones. I sat out on the porch until it got dark. The sunset was quiet and pink, with long shadows crawling across the clearing. That night, I built a small fire inside and read a paperback until I got tired. No phone, no music, just the wind through the trees. I slept okay the first night. Woke up once because of some distant rustling outside, but it was probably deer. I went back to sleep. The next day was more of the same. I walked around the woods, not straying too far from the cabin. I saw some animal tracks, deer, maybe a raccoon. At one point, I thought I heard something move through the brush behind me. But when I turned, nothing was there. I chalked it up to wind or maybe a squirrel. Still, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder a few times as I walked. That weird feeling, the one I always got in the woods, was creeping in, like something was watching. By the third day, that feeling was worse. I woke up early to a strange noise. It sounded like something tapping on wood. Not hard, more like fingernails or claws. I sat up in bed and listened. It stopped. I waited a while and then got up and looked outside. The clearing was empty. I stepped onto the porch barefoot and looked around. The grass had frost on it. Everything was still. The wind had died down during the night, so I could hear the smallest sounds. Birds calling, the creak of the porch boards under me, but nothing else. I thought maybe a bird had landed on the roof or something. I spent that day closer to the cabin. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt uneasy. I kept getting chills for no reason, and I noticed something weird. Every time I looked toward the tree line near the outhouse, I felt like something had just moved, like I'd missed it by a second. I'd stare hard, waiting, but nothing would happen. No sound, no movement, just that heavy, still feeling like something was standing behind those trees, watching me through the branches. That night, I didn't build a fire. I just crawled into bed early and pulled the blankets up. I lay there with my eyes closed, but I couldn't sleep. The silence felt loud. I listened hard for any sound, and sure enough, around midnight, I heard that tapping again. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the far wall, the one behind the wood stove. 3 taps, then silence. Then again. Tap, tap. I got up slowly, not turning on the lights. I didn't want to make any noise. I walked barefoot across the cold floor and stood near the wood stove, listening. The tapping had stopped. I waited a long time before moving the curtain on the window just a crack. The night outside was black. The trees looked like shapes in a painting. I couldn't see anything, but my stomach was tight, and I suddenly felt like I shouldn't be standing there, like I was exposing myself. I let the curtain fall and backed away. I grabbed my jacket and flashlight and sat on the couch with the light turned off, waiting. Nothing else happened that night. In the morning, I went outside and walked to the back wall where the tapping had come from. I looked around the base of the cabin. There were marks in the dirt. Not full footprints, the ground was too dry, but impressions, like something had been standing there. I looked closer and saw a line of small scratches in the wood, just above waist level, maybe 3 or 4 inches long. Thin. They didn't look fresh, but I hadn't seen them before. I ran my fingers over them. They felt deep, like something sharp had made them. I told myself it was probably some animal. Maybe a raccoon had climbed up or tried to get in. But why only at night? Why only once it was dead quiet? I spent that day inside. I kept the curtains shut and made myself a fire even though it wasn't that cold. I just needed the light and the sound. I kept checking the windows. I didn't eat much. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something that didn't want to be seen. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. But this time, it wasn't tapping. It was dragging. A slow sound, like something heavy being pulled across the porch boards. I froze in bed, clutching the blanket. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear. The dragging sound stopped. Then I heard the floorboards creak, like weight shifting. Then nothing. I got up, walked quietly down the hall, and grabbed the flashlight. I didn't turn it on. I stood in the living room, staring at the front door. I couldn't hear anything now, just silence, the kind of silence that presses on your ears. I stood there for maybe half an hour. Nothing moved. No more sounds. Then the doorknob rattled. Just once. A sharp jiggle like someone testing it. I dropped the flashlight. It hit the floor and rolled. The beam flicked on and lit up the wall. I scrambled to pick it up and aimed it at the door, hand shaking. I waited, but nothing else happened. I didn't go near the window. I just sat on the floor with the flashlight aimed at the door, and I stayed like that until the sun came up. When it did, I grabbed my stuff and threw it in the car. I didn't bother packing neatly. I didn't clean up. I just needed to leave. I opened the door slowly, holding the flashlight in my hand like a weapon. The porch was empty, but there were marks. Long, dark scuff marks across the wood, like something heavy had been dragged, just like the sound I'd heard. I followed them to the edge of the porch, where they disappeared into the dirt and led toward the tree line. I didn't follow them. I didn't even look up. I just got in the car and drove. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again. I pulled over and sat in the car, trying to catch my breath. I looked back once down the dirt road. Nothing was there. That was 6 months ago. I haven't been back. Ryan called me when he got home and asked how the trip was. I told him the truth, that something was wrong out there, that someone or something had been around the cabin at night. He brushed it off, said maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was a bear. Maybe I was just jumpy being alone. But a few weeks later, he called me again. He said he found new marks on the porch. Fresh ones, deep and straight and strange, just like I described. He said he was selling the place, and I haven't heard from him since. I booked the cabin out of desperation. Life had been too loud for too long. Work was draining me day by day. The city never stopped screaming, and I couldn't remember the last time I truly rested. It was early September when I found the listing. A remote cabin in the northern woods of Montana, deep off a service road with no neighbors within miles. The place didn't look fancy, and that was exactly what I wanted. Just a simple wooden cabin, surrounded by tall trees, with no Wi-Fi and no cell service. The host warned it was completely off-grid and isolated, but that was the appeal. I packed my gear with care. I brought a week's worth of groceries, canned stuff, dry snacks, frozen meat in a cooler with dry ice. I also packed a camping stove, a flashlight, extra batteries, a big knife, a first aid kit, 2 sets of clothes for each day, and my old hiking boots. I didn't want to come back to town for anything. I just wanted to sleep, maybe read, take some walks, and hear nothing but the wind and birds. The drive was long. After 5 hours of regular highway, I had to take a gravel service road that turned into a narrow dirt path winding between tall pines. My SUV bumped and rattled over roots and small rocks. It had rained a few days earlier, so the path was slick in places. I kept driving slowly, letting the tires roll carefully around puddles and soft ground. Finally, after almost an hour of creeping along that road, the trees thinned, and I saw the roof of the cabin ahead. It looked old but solid. 1-story, simple structure. A deep green roof that blended with the trees, weathered wood walls, a small porch, and a narrow chimney. The place was clean, though. No trash, no graffiti, no signs of anyone squatting. There was a small shed a few yards behind it, and a rusty water pump out front. A wooden sign nailed to the porch post simply said, Camp Ridgeview. I parked, turned off the engine, and just sat for a minute. The silence was total. No cars, no voices, not even planes overhead. I stepped out and stretched. The air smelled like pine and dirt, cool and clean. I unlocked the front door with the key the host mailed me and went inside. The cabin had one main room with a bed, a small couch, a table, and a wood-burning stove. To the right was a small kitchen area with a sink, a counter, and old cabinets. To the left was a door that led to a bathroom with a composting toilet and a basic shower setup. There was no electricity, but the windows let in light, and the host had stocked a few battery-powered lanterns and a solar-powered charger. It was cozy and quiet. That first day went peacefully. I unloaded my gear, stacked my food, tested the lanterns, and walked around the area. There was a narrow trail behind the cabin leading deeper into the woods. I didn't go far, just enough to get familiar. I found no signs of other people. No camps, no trash, no paths except animal tracks and the faint trail. I liked that. The only sounds were birds and wind. That night, I sat on the porch with a lantern and listened to the forest. I made a small dinner and ate it slow. I felt more relaxed than I had in months. When I went to bed, I slept heavy, like a switch had been flipped. It was the kind of sleep that leaves you confused when you wake up, because you didn't dream at all. The second day was just as calm. I explored the trail more, cooked, and read a book I'd brought. I even chopped a little wood from the pile behind the shed. I saw no animals, though I did find some old deer tracks near the trail. I liked the idea of wildlife being nearby, even if they didn't show up. That night, it rained lightly, tapping on the metal roof. I drifted off to sleep with the sound of rain in my ears. On the third day, things changed. I woke up early that morning, just as the sun rose, and stepped outside. The air felt colder than usual. The sky was overcast, and the woods looked darker. As I walked around the back, I noticed something strange near the edge of the trees. There were footprints in the soft dirt, but they weren't mine. These prints were wider, heavier, and deeper. They came from the woods and stopped about 30 feet from the cabin, then turned back. They weren't animal tracks. They were boots. I stared at them for a while. I hadn't heard anything the night before. No voices, no snapping twigs, nothing. I followed the prints a few feet into the trees but stopped when they vanished into harder ground. I didn't want to wander far without knowing more. I kept thinking maybe a hiker got lost and wandered through, but it didn't sit right. This cabin was far from any public trail. And if it was a hiker, why come so close and then leave without making contact? That night, I couldn't relax. I kept the lantern on and placed the big knife next to the bed. I left the door locked and even pushed a chair against it. I barely slept. Every sound outside made me sit up and hold my breath. At one point, I thought I heard faint crunching near the shed, but when I looked through the window, I saw nothing. The fourth day was overcast and cold. I tried to distract myself by hiking a bit further down the trail behind the cabin. I brought the knife in my backpack. After about 30 minutes of walking, I saw a piece of orange cloth snagged on a branch. It looked like part of a jacket or backpack strap. Fresh, not faded. I looked around but saw no one. I turned back early. The cabin didn't feel safe anymore. It felt like something was watching me. That night, I barely ate. I kept the fire going and checked the windows every hour. At around 1 a.m., I heard footsteps. Slow, heavy, circling the cabin. I didn't move. I sat frozen in the dark, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped for a few minutes. Then I heard a thud against the back wall, like someone bumped into it. Then silence. I stayed awake until dawn, knife in hand, staring at the door. When the sun came up, I went outside. There were fresh boot prints again, closer this time. One set came all the way to the back window under the bedroom. I found another near the shed. I opened the shed slowly, thinking maybe someone was hiding there, but it was empty. Just old tools and a broken lawn chair. I wanted to leave that day, but the road had become a mess from rain. My SUV couldn't grip well in the mud, and I knew I'd get stuck if I rushed it. I decided to wait one more day, let things dry, and then leave first thing in the morning. I kept everything packed and stayed inside. That night, I didn't sleep. At around 3 a.m., I saw movement. Through a crack in the window curtain, I spotted a figure standing at the tree line. Just standing there, too far to make out clearly, but it wasn't an animal. The figure didn't move for nearly 5 minutes. Then it turned and walked into the woods. I left the cabin at dawn. The ground was still soft, but I took it slow and managed to get back to the service road without getting stuck. My hands gripped the wheel so tight they ached by the time I hit pavement. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station in a nearby town. I didn't report it. I couldn't explain much, and there were no laws against standing in the woods. But I knew someone had been out there watching me for days, maybe longer. They never spoke, never broke in, never showed their face. But they wanted me to know they were there. Looking back, I think they were testing me, seeing how long I'd stay, how I'd react. They never crossed the line, but they came close. And that's worse in some ways. I still don't know what their plan was. Maybe they were just messing with me. Or maybe they were waiting for something. Either way, I never went back. I canceled the rest of my stay, blocked the host's messages, and swore off any future off-grid vacations. Now, whenever I hear people talk about escaping to the woods for peace, I feel a chill run down my spine, because I know what's out there, and I know that sometimes the scariest thing isn't what makes noise in the dark. It's what stands quietly, just outside the light, waiting. I never really liked people. Not in a bitter way, just in the way that I preferred being alone. That's probably why I chose the job I have, freelance software developer. No office, no coworkers, no loud clients breathing down my neck, just silence and code. I could go days without speaking to anyone, and it didn't bother me. After living in Seattle for most of my adult life, the noise of the city started to get to me. The endless honking, the flashing lights, the constant movement. I wanted something quiet, something far away, so I booked a remote cabin in western Montana. The listing said it was tucked away in the forest, no neighbors for miles. Off-grid,
No Wi-Fi.
no cell signal. That's exactly what I needed. I packed up my things and drove across 2 states. It was a long drive, about 13 hours, and I got there in the late afternoon. The dirt road leading to the cabin was barely visible, covered in grass and brush. I almost missed it. I drove about half a mile through the woods, dodging potholes and low branches until the cabin came into view. It was small and made of faded gray wood. There was a small porch out front, a narrow chimney sticking out of the roof, and a green metal shed about 30 feet away. The cabin was exactly what I was looking for. Inside, there was a small wood stove in the corner, a table and chair near the single window, a bed with a thick blanket, and a little kitchenette with a pump sink and shelves of canned food. The place smelled like dust and pine. There was a box of firewood stacked next to the stove and a large jug of water on the counter. Everything looked untouched, like no one had been here for months. That night, I lit a fire and laid in bed listening to the quiet.
No sirens.
No traffic, just the faint creak of trees in the wind. Felt strange at first, almost too quiet, but I fell asleep quickly, the kind of deep sleep you only get when you're completely disconnected. The next morning, I woke up early and made some instant coffee using the water and a small camping stove I had brought. I took the cup outside and sat on the porch. The sky was clear, and I could hear birds calling out in the trees. There was something pure about the air out there, clean, crisp. I remember thinking how I hadn't felt this calm in years. Later that day, I decided to explore the area a bit. I had packed light but brought along a good pair of boots and a hiking backpack with basic survival gear. I didn't plan on going far, just enough to get a feel for the land. I walked behind the cabin where the woods grew thicker. Pines and firs grew close together, and the forest floor was covered in brown needles, moss, and fallen branches. I found a narrow game trail and followed it for about a mile. There were no signs of people, no trash, no footprints, nothing. After a couple of hours, I circled back to the cabin. I read a bit, wrote some notes in my journal, and went to bed early again. That became my routine for the next few days. Waking up with the sun, exploring, eating, reading, and sleeping. The peace started to settle into my bones. But around the 5th day, things started to feel different. I woke up to the sound of something tapping on the wall. I figured it was just a branch blowing in the wind, but when I stepped outside, the air was still. No wind, no movement. I walked around the cabin but didn't see anything out of place. The woods were calm. That night, I had trouble sleeping. It wasn't that I was scared, just uneasy. I kept hearing things, little sounds like a twig snapping or leaves crunching. But every time I got up and looked outside, I didn't see anything. No animals, no movement, just the trees and the moonlight. I told myself I was overthinking it. Maybe I wasn't used to how loud nature could be when everything else was silent. On the 6th day, I hiked deeper into the woods. I wanted to find out how far the forest stretched behind the cabin. After 2 hours of walking, I found a small stream. The water was clear and cold. I sat beside it and ate a granola bar, watching the way the sunlight filtered through the trees. On my way back, I took a slightly different path and stumbled across something odd. A tree with deep gouges in the bark, like something had clawed it. At first, I figured it was a bear, but the markings were too high and uneven. I looked around but didn't see any tracks. Just that tree standing alone with claw marks going up its trunk. I got back to the cabin just before sunset and sat on the porch again. The woods felt heavier that night, like something was out there. I didn't want to admit it, but I could feel something watching me. When I went to bed, I left the fire burning. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a soft thud outside. Not like a falling branch, more like a footstep. Slow, heavy. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling. Then another thud. Closer. I sat up slowly and listened. Silence. I waited about 10 minutes before getting up and walking to the window. I stood to the side of it so I wouldn't be lit by the firelight. I looked out but saw nothing. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I noticed something by the edge of the trees. A shape, not moving, just standing there. It was tall, maybe 6 feet, and wide at the shoulders. I could barely see it, just a dark outline against the trees. I stood there for a long time, not moving. After what felt like forever, the shape turned and walked back into the woods. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it. Maybe it was a tree. Maybe the firelight played tricks on my eyes. But something inside me knew I had seen it. I packed my bag and hiked to the stream again, mostly just to get away from the cabin for a while. When I got back that afternoon, I noticed something strange. One of my boots, which I had left on the porch to dry, was gone. The other was still there. I searched around the cabin, thinking maybe an animal dragged it off, but I couldn't find it anywhere. There were no signs of chewing or tearing. Just one boot missing. I stayed inside for the rest of the day. I kept the fire going and moved the small table in front of the door. Felt silly, but it made me feel safer. I didn't go outside again that night. I sat with my back to the wall, holding a hatchet I had found in the shed. Around midnight, I heard something again. Footsteps. This time, they circled the cabin. I could hear them moving slowly, crunching the dry pine needles. At one point, the footsteps stopped right outside the wall near my bed. I held my breath, and then came a sound that still gives me chills. Slow, deliberate breathing. It wasn't an animal. It sounded human. Long inhales, sharp exhales, right outside the wall. I stayed like that until the sun started to rise. When I finally stepped outside, there were footprints all around the cabin. Barefoot, human. The ground was soft from the rain 2 nights before, so the prints were clear. They circled the cabin multiple times, and I counted at least 15 distinct prints. All barefoot, all from one person. I followed them for a while, but they just led into the woods and disappeared. That was the moment I decided to leave. I packed what I could, grabbed the axe, and locked the cabin door behind me. I had a few hours of hiking ahead of me before reaching the main road, and I didn't want to take any chances. I kept checking over my shoulder the whole time. Every sound made my heart race. Every crack of a branch made me freeze. After 2 hours, I stopped to drink water. That's when I heard it, movement behind me. Not far. I crouched low and scanned the trees. About 30 feet away, I saw him. A man. He was standing behind a tree, half hidden. No clothes, pale skin, covered in dirt. Just watching me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. He didn't say a word. Just stood there with his head tilted slightly. Then he stepped back behind the tree and disappeared. I ran. I didn't stop. I don't even remember the rest of the hike. I just remember bursting out onto the gravel road, stumbling and sweating, and flagging down the first truck I saw. The man driving didn't ask many questions. He could tell I had been through something. He gave me water and drove me back to town. I reported everything to the sheriff. He said they'd look into it. I gave them directions to the cabin, told them everything I saw. A week later, I got a call from a deputy. They went out there. They found the cabin. They found the clawed tree. They even found the barefoot prints. But they didn't find the man. I never went back. I left Montana and returned to the city. For a while, I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining that breathing outside my window, the slow footsteps, the pale face hiding behind the trees. People ask me sometimes if I'll ever go off-grid again. I tell them no, never. Silence isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it means something is waiting, watching, and when no one else is around, there's no one to help you if it decides to come closer. I never planned on staying in that cabin for more than 3 days. The idea was simple. Get away from the city for a bit, leave behind the noise, the constant pings from my phone, and the never-ending tasks at work. I wanted to be alone to reset. I booked a small off-grid cabin in Pine Hollow, a quiet place about 4 hours away from where I lived. It sat at the edge of a deep forest. No neighbors, no nearby towns, just trees and silence. I didn't know it then, but that trip would change the way I saw the world. And I'd never feel completely safe again. I left early in the morning. The roads were mostly empty. It was autumn, late October. The leaves had turned orange and red, and some were already falling. The drive felt peaceful at first. I had packed everything I thought I'd need: food, a small gas stove, flashlight, spare batteries, water jugs, first aid kit, and even a signal booster for emergencies. I'd read online that signal was bad in Pine Hollow. When I reached the dirt road that led to the cabin, I noticed how quiet everything became. No more cars, no buildings, no people. Just long, winding dirt, patches of fog in the trees, and the crunch of my tires over loose gravel. The cabin finally came into view after about 15 minutes of driving through the woods. It was smaller than I imagined. Wooden, dark brown, with a tin roof that looked a little rusted. There was a small porch and 2 windows facing the front. No lights, no electricity. It looked old, but not falling apart. I parked near a crooked wooden post that marked the parking spot. I stepped out and took a deep breath. The air smelled like pine, damp soil, and a hint of firewood, though there wasn't a soul nearby. Everything was still. I could hear a few birds somewhere far off, but mostly it was just silence. I unlocked the door with the code the owner gave me and stepped inside. The inside was simple. A single room with a small wood stove in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed against the wall, and a shelf with a few pots and pans. There was also a cabinet with canned food, a few candles, matches, and a journal from previous visitors. It was colder than I expected, but I figured I'd light a fire soon. There was a pile of chopped wood just outside. I spent the first few hours getting settled. I brought in my bags, unpacked what I needed, then made some instant coffee on the gas stove and sat on the porch. That was when I noticed something a little odd. There were no sounds, no animals rustling, no wind moving the trees. It was like the forest was holding its breath. I shook it off, blaming it on how unfamiliar the place was. That night, I didn't sleep well. The wind had picked up, and it made the trees creak loudly. The tin roof rattled now and then, and I kept waking up thinking I heard footsteps outside. But each time I looked out the window, there was nothing. I reminded myself I was alone out here and that my mind was just playing tricks. City noise keeps you from noticing every creak, every pop. Out here, silence made everything louder. The next day, I went for a short hike down a nearby trail. I brought my backpack, water, and my folding knife just in case. The woods were thick, with lots of fallen logs and leaves covering the ground. I noticed some strange markings on the trees. Long vertical lines carved deep into the bark. Not initials, not names, just deep, straight scratches. I found maybe 4 or 5 trees like that spaced out along the trail. I figured maybe it was some kind of forestry sign or an animal marking territory. After about an hour, I turned back. I had this growing feeling in my gut that I wasn't alone. It felt like something was watching me, just out of view. I kept stopping to look around, but nothing moved. The silence was heavy again. Not even birds, just wind now and then, and those tall trees swaying slightly. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the door and pushed a chair in front of it without even thinking. I didn't feel safe, and I didn't know why. That night, the fire in the stove burned low, and I sat near it reading. Around midnight, I heard something outside. A single loud crack like a branch breaking, then silence again. I froze. I held my breath, listening hard. I heard another crunch, slow, heavy, like footsteps on dry leaves. It was right outside the cabin. I didn't move. The window didn't have curtains, but the fire behind me made it impossible to see outside clearly. I killed the lantern and sat in the dark, heart racing. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard what sounded like breathing. Slow, steady breathing just beyond the wall. Then nothing. I didn't sleep that night at all. I kept the knife in my hand, sitting on the bed, listening for any sign of movement. Eventually, the sky started to lighten, and the birds finally came back. I got up and looked outside. No footprints, no broken branches, just a few leaves blown around by the wind. I told myself it could have been a deer or maybe a bear, but the breathing had sounded human, and bears don't breathe that quietly. That morning I tried calling someone, but my phone had no signal, not even with the booster. I walked a few hundred feet down the dirt road, climbed onto a rock, and held the phone up high. Still nothing. I thought about leaving, but the owner wouldn't be back for another week, and I had no one expecting me home urgently. I told myself to stay calm, to finish the trip like I planned. I was fine. Later that day, I noticed something strange again. A pile of small rocks stacked neatly on the edge of the porch. I hadn't seen them before. They were balanced carefully, 5 rocks tall. I didn't build it. I hadn't even seen rocks like that nearby. I knocked it over without thinking and went back inside. That night, the breathing came back. Same spot, outside the wall near the bed. This time, I didn't just sit there. I moved silently to the door and listened. The breathing continued for maybe 10 more seconds. Then it stopped. Then I heard a long, dragging sound, like something being pulled across the dirt. I opened the window just a crack and saw nothing but darkness. I barely slept again. I sat with my knife, staring at the door. Something was out there. I didn't know if it was a person or an animal, but it knew I was here, and it wasn't going away. The next morning, I found a single rock sitting on the windowsill. I picked it up and threw it deep into the woods. My heart was racing again, and I knew something wasn't right. I needed to leave. I packed up everything fast and loaded it into my car. But when I turned the key, the engine didn't start. Clicked a few times, then nothing. I opened the hood, checked the battery. Everything looked fine. I tried again. Nothing. I stood there in silence, looking around the empty woods. That feeling came back, stronger than before, that deep sense of being watched. I locked myself inside the cabin and pushed the table against the door this time. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I just waited. That night, something knocked on the back wall of the cabin. A single knock, then 3 more. Slow, heavy. I didn't move. I sat there for over an hour, barely breathing. It never came to the front, never tried the door. But the knocks happened again, this time on the side wall. Always 1 knock, then 3. It stopped around 3 a.m., and I didn't sleep a second. At first light, I took my backpack, knife, water, and a can of food, and I left the cabin on foot. I locked the door behind me and followed the dirt road. I didn't have cell signal, but I knew if I walked far enough, I'd reach the main road. I walked for over 2 hours before I heard something behind me. Footsteps, not animals, human. I stopped and turned around, but the road was empty. I kept walking, faster this time. Every so often I'd hear the steps again. Sometimes faster, sometimes slower, but always just out of view. I broke into a jog, then a run. I didn't stop until I reached a small clearing with an old wooden sign nailed to a post. It was rotted and unreadable, but I knew I had reached the main road. Not long after, a ranger truck came by. I flagged it down, waving both arms. I told the ranger my car wouldn't start and that I'd been hearing strange noises at night. He drove me back to the cabin. We checked the car together, and when he turned the key, the engine started right up. He looked at me like I was crazy. I felt crazy. Back in the city, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept checking my windows at night, listening for breathing or knocks. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to sound paranoid. Weeks went by, then months. One day, I received a small package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a rock, flat and smooth, just like the one I found on the windowsill. No note, just the rock. I moved a week later, changed my number. I never went back to Pine Hollow, and I never will. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I think I hear breathing outside my window, and sometimes I still find rocks stacked near my porch. After months of working long shifts at the warehouse, barely sleeping, barely eating right, barely talking to anyone except coworkers or a few online friends, I just felt done. It was one of those times where everything feels heavy, like you're dragging a weight behind you every day. I needed something to clear my head, something far from traffic, ringing phones, and the routine that was making me feel more like a machine than a person. I found the cabin by chance. I was scrolling through a site that listed quiet getaways, nothing fancy, mostly basic off-grid spots. The pictures weren't great, but it looked peaceful. It was up in the hills near a place called Ridge Creek. The ad said it had no Wi-Fi, no electricity, just a propane stove, a well for water, a wood-burning heater, and a small bed. That's exactly what I wanted. I booked it for 10 days. The drive there took almost 6 hours. After the last stretch of paved road, I had to drive for about 40 minutes on a rough dirt trail. My old car hated it. The gravel crunched under the tires, and branches scraped the sides like nails. I passed no other cars. The trees were thick, and the road got narrower the deeper I went. By the time I reached the cabin, it was late afternoon. It sat in a clearing surrounded by tall pine trees and brush. The place was smaller than I thought, maybe the size of a single-room studio apartment. The wooden exterior looked aged, not run down, but definitely old. The roof was metal, probably tin or something like it, and rust streaks ran down the back near the chimney. There was a small porch, a broken bench, and a rusted axe leaning against a log. It didn't feel welcoming, not really, but I told myself that was the point. I wasn't here for comfort. I was here for silence. Inside was simple. One bed, one chair, a small table, a narrow shelf with a few dusty books, a wood-burning stove with a stack of logs beside it, and a single window on each wall. No curtains. The floor creaked, the boards uneven in places. There was a faint smell of old wood, ash, and something else I couldn't place. Maybe mold. There was a locked cabinet near the back. A note on the table said it held extra supplies. First aid kit, a backup lantern, and some dry goods. The key was hanging on a nail above the stove. I unpacked quickly, just a small duffel, some canned food, matches, a flashlight, a knife, and 2 large water jugs. I also had a printed map of the area. The well was about 60 feet behind the cabin, next to an old pump. The outhouse was another 20 feet behind that. I sat outside on the porch that evening, watching the sky turn orange, then purple. I didn't see a single plane, didn't hear a single car. Just birds, some insects, the soft creak of trees swaying. It was so quiet it almost felt loud, if that makes sense. My ears weren't used to it. The first night was fine. I lit the stove, warmed up a can of soup, and read a few pages from a paperback I brought. I fell asleep fast, wrapped in a thick sleeping bag on the old mattress. The wind howled through the trees a bit, and some branches scratched the roof, but nothing that really bothered me. Day 2, I hiked a short trail I found behind the cabin. It wasn't marked, just a narrow path someone had clearly walked many times. It led to a dried creek bed, maybe a mile away. Along the way, I saw deer tracks, old ones, and something larger, maybe elk. I didn't bring a gun, just a knife and a small can of bear spray. Probably not the smartest move, but I didn't plan to go far from the cabin anyway. That night, I heard something strange. Around midnight, I was still awake, lying in bed staring at the ceiling. I heard what sounded like soft crunching outside, like someone walking slowly in the brush. Not a deer. Too heavy. Too steady. I sat up and listened harder. It stopped. I waited. Then the sound came again, from a different direction. Closer. I grabbed the flashlight, turned it on, and pointed it out the front window. Nothing. The trees moved a little with the wind, but I couldn't see anything out of place. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a bear or a coyote. I stayed awake for another hour, just listening, before I finally drifted off. By day 4, something felt off. I started noticing little things. The front door was cracked open when I woke up, even though I knew I latched it the night before. I checked twice because of the noise. There were boot prints in the dirt just off the porch. Not mine. I always wore hiking shoes, and these were deeper, wider. At first, I thought maybe they were old prints. Maybe someone else had been here before me, but they looked fresh, still crisp at the edges. The heel mark was sunk in like someone heavy had stood there. I didn't panic. I thought maybe a ranger or someone had come by to check on the property. Still, I didn't like it. I kept the knife on me the rest of the day. That night, I locked the door, double-checked it, then propped a chair under the handle. I also stacked a few empty cans in front of it so I'd hear if anyone came in. Around 2 a.m., I heard movement again. This time it was louder. Not walking, shuffling, then a tap on the wall. Just one. Not an animal. Not wind. I sat in bed, heart pounding, not even breathing. Then another tap. Same spot. I waited for what felt like forever. It stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. There were marks in the dirt near the back window. Smudged prints. A few strands of something stuck to the wood, maybe hair, maybe threads. Couldn't tell. I didn't touch it. I looked for trail cams or signs that someone else might be nearby. Nothing. I thought about leaving, but I was 4 days in. Just 6 more to go. I told myself it was nerves. Maybe an animal really did brush against the cabin. But I didn't believe it. That afternoon, I filled both water jugs at the well. The pump was old, heavy, and groaned every time I pulled it. The water was cold and tasted metallic. As I walked back, I caught movement in the trees to my left. I stopped, waited. Nothing moved again. I walked faster. Back inside, I checked all the windows and doors again. Everything seemed in place. But later that evening, I noticed something had been moved on the shelf. A book that I hadn't touched was lying flat instead of upright. That freaked me out more than the noises. Someone had been inside. I checked the lockbox near the back. The key was still hanging, but the supplies inside had been shifted. Nothing missing, just moved. I decided to sleep during the day and stay up at night. For the next 3 nights, I stayed awake, flashlight in hand, knife close. The noises came back each time. Sometimes it was just shuffling. Sometimes it was tapping. Once, I swear I heard breathing just outside the front window, slow and heavy, but I never saw anyone. One night, I stepped outside just before dawn, thinking whoever it was might be gone by then. I looked around with the flashlight. Trees, brush, shadows. Then I saw it. A wire, thin, metal, barely visible, stretched between 2 trees about chest high, right near the path to the outhouse. It hadn't been there before. It looked like a trip line. That was it. I packed as fast as I could. I didn't care if it was 6 a.m. I threw everything into my bag, locked the cabin out of habit, and ran to the car. The air was cold, my breath sharp in my throat. The key fumbled in my hand. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped it twice. The car finally started. I backed up too fast, ran over some brush, but I didn't stop. I didn't breathe right until I hit pavement again. An hour later, I drove all the way back home that same day. I reported what happened to the company that rented the cabin. I told them about the footprints, the noises, the wire. They said they'd send someone to check. I never heard back. I didn't ask again. Weeks passed. I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up thinking I heard tapping, or footsteps, or breathing. I started locking every door in my apartment, even the bathroom. Eventually, I stopped thinking about it every day. But I still don't go hiking anymore. I haven't camped since. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I stayed the full 10 days. Sometimes I wonder if someone else will book that same cabin and not leave early like I did. All I know is I got lucky, really lucky. It was early October when I decided to take a week off from everything and head to the mountains. My plan was simple. I'd found a remote cabin for rent, sitting deep in the Colorado wilderness, not far from the Wyoming border. No cell service, no internet, just a wooden structure, a stocked kitchen, a fireplace, and a small bedroom. The place was advertised as off-grid, but it had solar panels and a backup generator, so I figured I'd be fine. I needed the quiet, away from the city noise, emails, and endless messages. The drive took most of the day. The last few miles were just dirt roads winding through thick pine forests. My tires kicked up dry dust and small rocks as I drove. I passed a broken-down sign that said private property. Enter at your own risk. It looked weathered and half-rotted, almost like a joke. I kept going. After about another mile, the trees opened up to a clearing, and there it was, the cabin. It was smaller than I thought, maybe 30 feet across. Dark wooden walls, a front porch with a single rocking chair, and a woodpile stacked neatly to the side. It looked like it hadn't been used in a while. I parked beside it, got out, stretched, and immediately noticed how quiet everything was. No birds, no wind, no bugs, just stillness. Felt good, peaceful. Inside, the place smelled like old cedar and dry dust. The furniture was simple, a couch that looked like it had been there for years, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and shelves filled with books and maps. The kitchen was tiny but clean. There was a gas stove, a sink connected to a rainwater tank, and a small fridge that ran off the solar battery. The bedroom had a full bed and a small window that looked out into the woods. I unpacked, opened a beer, and sat on the porch. The sun dipped low behind the trees, and the temperature dropped fast. I threw on a jacket and watched the sky turn orange and then purple. It was the most peaceful I'd felt in months. That first night was uneventful. I made some soup, read a book by lantern light, and fell asleep easily. But sometime after midnight, I woke up freezing. The fire had died out. I got up, added logs, and stood there for a minute, rubbing my hands. That's when I thought I heard something outside. Twigs snapping. It wasn't loud, just a quick crack. I stood still, listening. Then nothing. I figured it was a deer or maybe a branch falling. I went back to bed. The next day, I hiked the trail behind the cabin. It led uphill to a ridge that looked out over the valley. The view was amazing. Miles of forest, untouched and quiet. I spent most of the day up there, taking photos, eating snacks, and just sitting. On the way back, I took a different trail, hoping it would loop around. Didn't. I ended up bushwhacking through undergrowth, thorns scratching at my jeans. I got turned around a little, but eventually I found my way back by using the sun. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something small and strange. The front door was open a few inches. I was sure I had closed it that morning. I stood there for a minute, just staring at it. Then I slowly pushed it open and stepped inside. Everything looked normal. My backpack was where I left it. Nothing was moved. Nothing was missing. I checked the bathroom, the closet, even under the bed. It was empty. I figured maybe I hadn't latched the door properly. The wind could have pushed it open. Still, it left me unsettled. That night, I kept the fire going and pushed a chair under the door handle just in case. I didn't sleep well. Every sound outside made me sit up. Branches creaking, dry leaves blowing across the porch. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps in the gravel outside, but when I looked through the window, it was empty, just trees and darkness. By the third day, I was feeling jumpy. I kept thinking about the door. I started double-checking everything. I kept the curtains closed. I even moved a heavy cabinet in front of the back door. I didn't hike that day. I stayed close to the cabin, chopping wood, organizing supplies, and keeping busy. But the silence had shifted. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt heavy, like something was watching. Late that afternoon, I walked to the edge of the woods behind the cabin. I stood there for a while, looking into the trees. The sun was low, and the shadows were long. That's when I saw it. Something moved between the trees about 50 yards away. It was fast, low to the ground. I couldn't tell what it was. Maybe a bear, but it didn't move like a bear. Too quiet, too smooth. It disappeared behind a tree and didn't come out the other side. I waited. Nothing. Then I turned and walked quickly back to the cabin. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the lights on and sat in the main room with a kitchen knife in my lap. I felt ridiculous, but something wasn't right. Just after 2 a.m., I heard it again. Slow footsteps outside, moving through the leaves. Then something brushed against the side of the cabin. Not hard, just a soft scrape, like fingers or claws dragging along the wall. I held my breath. The steps moved toward the porch. Then the boards creaked. I stared at the door. The chair was still jammed underneath the handle. The creaking stopped. I waited for what felt like forever. Then it was quiet again. When the sun came up, I went outside. There were footprints in the dirt. Not boots, not paws, bare human feet. One set. They circled the cabin. They were small, too small for a man. The toes were long. I followed them around the side of the cabin. Then they stopped, vanished into the woods. I packed everything. I didn't care about the week I'd planned. I was done. I loaded the car and left that morning. But when I got to the main dirt road, there was a tree across it. A big pine, freshly fallen. No chainsaw in my trunk. Couldn't move it. I tried driving around it, but the ditch on the side was too deep. I went back to the cabin. I kept the fire going constantly. I stayed inside. 2 more nights. On the second night, I woke up again to footsteps. This time, they didn't just walk around. They stopped right outside the bedroom window. I didn't move. I stayed in bed, clutching the knife. Then I heard breathing. It stayed there for almost an hour. When I finally looked out the window in the morning, I saw smudges on the glass. Greasy, long handprints. But again, nothing was taken. Nothing inside was touched. That day, I walked back down the road with a hatchet and started chopping the fallen tree. It took me half the day to cut through enough to make a path for my car to squeeze through. My hands were blistered. I didn't stop. When I finally cleared it, I didn't even go back to grab everything. I just drove. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest gas station nearly 30 miles away. I looked like hell. My hands were cut, my eyes bloodshot. I filled up the tank and sat in the car for almost an hour before I drove home. I never reported anything. What would I even say? I didn't tell friends. I didn't leave a review. I didn't want to talk about it. Weeks later, I got a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single Polaroid picture. It was a photo of me, standing at the edge of the woods on that third day. In the picture, I wasn't alone. It was late October when I decided to spend a week alone in a small cabin in the northern woods of Wisconsin. I had found the listing online. It was owned by some older couple who barely used it anymore. It looked old but clean. No running water, just a well pump outside, and power came from a small gas generator. There was a wood stove for heat. I didn't mind the lack of modern things. I needed the silence. I needed to be away from the city noise, the constant pressure from work, and people always needing something. I figured a week with no phone service and nothing but trees and cold air might fix something in me that had been worn out for a long time. The drive there took longer than I expected. I left early in the morning, but I didn't arrive until close to sunset. The last hour was on gravel roads. The trees were thick, orange and yellow leaves covering the ground and blowing across the road. I didn't pass a single house once I turned off the highway. It was just forest, and I kept losing signal, which was expected. The directions said to look for a blue reflector nailed to a tree. That's where the turnoff was. It wasn't even a driveway, just 2 deep tire tracks in the dirt and leaves leading into the woods. I followed it in my truck for maybe half a mile until I reached the clearing. The cabin sat alone in the center, a little slanted, the wood weathered. There was a small shed to the left of it and a stack of chopped wood under a lean-to on the right. Behind it, the trees rose up again like a wall. I got out, stretched, and let the cold air hit me. It smelled like wet leaves and old pine. Inside, the cabin was one big room with a bed on one side and a wood stove in the middle. There was a table, a couple chairs, and a counter with a basin for washing. I lit some candles I brought and started a fire in the stove. I brought enough food to last me the week. Mostly canned stuff, bread, and a small cooler of things that might spoil. There was a compost toilet out back in a little shack. It wasn't going to be luxury, but I wasn't looking for that. I just wanted silence. The first night was peaceful. I stayed up reading, wrapped in a blanket. I could hear the wind in the trees, but that was about it. The cabin creaked a little, but it was nothing unexpected. It got really cold after midnight, but the stove kept it bearable. I fell asleep with the fire still going. The next morning, I woke up early. It was colder than I thought it would be, and I had to get the fire going again. I boiled some water over the stove for coffee, then took a short walk into the woods behind the cabin. The forest was thick, but it wasn't too hard to move through. I didn't go too far, just far enough to get a sense of the area. There were no trails, just woods. When I got back, I noticed something strange. The woodpile looked different. I couldn't tell exactly what, but it just didn't look the way it did when I arrived. I brushed it off. Maybe I was just remembering it wrong. Maybe I moved a log and forgot. I stayed inside most of that day, just reading, writing, and drinking coffee. At night, I went outside to use the outhouse and felt like someone was watching me. That kind of thing happens when you're alone in the woods. I told myself it was just the dark playing tricks. The next day, it rained, cold and steady. I stayed inside again. At one point, I thought I heard something outside the cabin, like footsteps, but when I looked through the window, I didn't see anything. I didn't go out. That night, I made sure the door was locked and shoved one of the chairs under the handle just in case. I didn't sleep much. I kept waking up and listening. The wind had picked up, and I thought I heard something moving out there. Not just wind, something heavier. The morning was quiet again, but when I stepped outside, there were prints in the mud.
Bootprints.
Not mine. They led from the woods to the side of the cabin and then back into the trees. They weren't fresh, probably made the day before during the rain, but they hadn't been there the last time I checked. I stood there for a long time looking at them. Then I walked around the cabin and checked everything. The shed was still locked. The outhouse was untouched, but the woodpile looked even more messed up. Some logs were taken out and stacked differently, like someone had gone through them. That day, I stayed near the cabin. I didn't go into the woods. I kept looking around, waiting to hear something. Nothing happened, but the feeling that someone had been there stuck with me. That night was worse. I kept the fire going and every light I had on. Around 2 a.m., I heard something outside. A branch broke. Then I heard it again, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. I didn't move. I just listened. I grabbed the axe I brought for splitting wood and sat on the bed with it in my hands. The steps circled the cabin, then stopped. I waited for what felt like hours. Nothing else happened. In the morning, I looked again. More prints. A lot of them. Someone had walked all the way around the cabin several times. The woodpile had been touched again. This time, a log had been placed standing upright in the center of the clearing, maybe 10 feet from the cabin door, just standing there by itself. I wanted to leave. I packed some of my things and threw them in the truck. I turned the key, but the engine didn't turn over. I tried again. Nothing. It was like the battery was dead. But I had used the truck just 3 days ago. I hadn't left any lights on. There was no cell signal. I tried walking up the path back toward the road, thinking I might get a bar or two if I got high enough, but nothing. Just trees and more trees. It was at least 5 miles back to the highway. I came back to the cabin and stayed inside. I locked the door, pushed the table in front of it, and didn't sleep. I stayed up all night with the axe, listening. I heard movement again, but it stayed farther away. Still, I didn't let the fire die. On the 5th day, I woke up and found another log standing in the clearing. Now there were 2, side by side, like markers. I walked around the cabin again. This time I noticed something scratched into the wall near the back corner. Just a line, a deep, wide line cut into the wood. I didn't know what it meant, but it made my stomach sink. I stayed inside all day, windows covered. I kept hearing sounds, sticks breaking, breathing, maybe. I was losing track of time. My food was almost gone. The cooler was warm now. Ate what I could. The 6th night was the worst. Around midnight, something banged on the cabin wall. Just once, loud and sharp, then silence. I sat on the floor with my back to the bed, axe in hand, staring at the door. Hours passed. At some point, I must have passed out. When I woke up, the front door was wide open. I didn't move. I just stared at it. The table had been pushed aside. The chair was on the floor. My pack was gone. The axe was still in my hand. Outside, 3 logs were standing now. Lined up. I ran. I didn't think. I just ran up the path, past the trees, past everything. I didn't stop until I saw the highway. A truck was passing by, and I ran into the road waving my arms. They stopped. I never went back. I called the owners and told them what happened. They didn't believe me, said maybe a bear had wandered near or maybe I was imagining things from being alone. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know someone was out there. The woods are quiet, but they're never empty.